There is something quietly extraordinary about falling asleep to the sound of a story. Not a loud story. Not one that demands your full attention or keeps you sitting up straight with your eyes wide open and your mind racing. No, this is a different kind of story. This is the kind of story you let wash over you like a warm tide coming in slowly from somewhere very far away. You do not need to memorize any of it. You do not need to take notes. You do not need to understand every single word or follow every single thread. You just need to let it happen, the way sleep itself happens, gradually and then all at once, softly and without you ever quite noticing the exact moment it begins. Tonight we are going to talk about one of the most fascinating, strange, and surprisingly thoughtful dimensions of a show that most people write off as pure chaos. We are going to talk about Family Guy and its extraordinary, decades-long habit of making jokes about real people, not fictional people, not composite characters loosely inspired by public figures. Real, actual, named, living and breathing human beings, presidents and pop stars, athletes and actors, comedians and criminals, political commentators and international royalty, murderers who got away with it, celebrities who later turned out to have done terrible things. A man named James Woods who became so intertwined with the show's identity that his real-life persona and his animated version eventually became almost impossible to separate. This is a show that has been on the air since 1999, with a brief and strange cancellation in the early 2000s before a triumphant return. And in all those decades, it has never lost its appetite for poking, prodding, satirizing, celebrating, mocking, and occasionally deeply embarrassing the real human beings who share the planet with the Griffin family. And what makes this so interesting, what makes it worthy of a long, slow, sleepy evening of exploration, is not simply that the jokes exist. Plenty of shows make jokes about real people. Saturday Night Live has been doing it since the 1970s. Late-night television runs on celebrity impressions and political satire. No, what makes Family Guy's relationship with real people so uniquely compelling is how it evolved over time, how it went from simple punchlines to something that, in retrospect, looks almost prophetic, how it revealed the anxieties of the culture that produced it, how it managed to be wildly offensive to some people while being eerily accurate about others, and how, in the process of all that, it created some of the most memorable moments in the history of animated comedy. So, settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Let the tension in your jaw go loose. We are not in a hurry here. There is nowhere else you need to be, nothing pressing, demanding your attention. This story has been over 20 years in the making, and we are going to walk through it together, slowly and gently, from the very beginning. Family Guy premiered on the 31st of January 1999. Seth MacFarlane was 25 years old. 25. He had sold the show to Fox based on 2 short animated films he made while studying at the Rhode Island School of Design, and the network gave him something almost no network gives a 25-year-old, a primetime animated series with a real budget and a real time slot. MacFarlane, for his part, created something that felt genuinely unlike anything else on television at the time. Yes, it owed obvious debts to The Simpsons, which had been redefining animated comedy for a decade by that point. But Family Guy had its own energy. It was more aggressive, more chaotic, more willing to break the fourth wall, to interrupt its own narrative for a completely unrelated cutaway gag, to go somewhere The Simpsons never would have dared. The Griffin family at the center of it all was a beautifully dysfunctional unit. Peter, the father, was loud and oblivious, and occasionally cruel in the way that only deeply stupid people can be cruel, without malice but with tremendous consequence. Lois, the mother, was the long-suffering straight man who occasionally revealed depths of her own darkness. Meg was the perpetual target of the family's contempt, a running gag that grew more uncomfortable the older you got and the more you thought about it. Chris was gentle and strange. Stewie was a baby who spoke in the accent of a British villain and spent much of his time plotting the murder of his own mother, a joke that the show itself seemed to forget about as the seasons wore on, and Stewie became more of a lovable eccentric than a genuine threat. And Brian was the dog, a martini-drinking, novel-writing, perpetually pretentious golden retriever who served as the show's philosophical conscience, such as it was. They lived in a fictional Rhode Island town with a name we will not use tonight, because the sound of it tends to wake people up with its particular energy. Instead, let us simply call it The Town. A small, working-class, quietly absurd New England town where nothing too terrible ever permanently happened, and where the laws of cause and effect operated with the same loose logic as a dream. From the very beginning, the show had no compunction about name-dropping real people. Early episodes featured jokes about celebrities that were blunt and simple, the kind of joke you might hear at a family dinner, where someone makes a reference to a tabloid headline they half remembered from a waiting room magazine. But as the show found its footing, as MacFarlane and his team of writers grew more confident, the references became more elaborate, more pointed, more willing to linger. A cutaway gag about a celebrity might last 10 seconds in one episode and 2 full minutes in another. Some real people became recurring fixtures, showing up again and again across multiple seasons in ways that built, whether intentionally or not, into something resembling a portrait. And tonight we are going to examine all of them, every major strand of this long and tangled web. We are going to move through it at a pace that is gentle and unhurried, pausing to look closely at the most interesting moments, the most revealing jokes, the ones that made people laugh and the ones that made people uncomfortable, and occasionally the ones that turned out, years later, to have been saying something genuinely true. But first, before we go any further, a word about what makes a joke about a real person different from a joke about a fictional person. When a sitcom makes a joke about a character they invented, the joke exists in a sealed universe. Whatever happens to that character, whatever embarrassment or humiliation or absurdity the writers visit upon them, it stays within the fiction. The character cannot be harmed. They cannot read what was written about them. They cannot feel wounded or grateful or anything at all, because they are not real. But when a show makes a joke about a real person, something more complicated happens. The joke escapes the fiction. It lands in the real world, where the real person actually lives, where their family lives, where their colleagues and fans and critics live. And depending on what the joke says, it can do real things. It can change public perception. It can resurface in uncomfortable moments. It can predict things that later turn out to be true. It can be kind or cruel or somewhere in the vast middle ground between those two poles. Family Guy has occupied every point on that spectrum. There have been jokes that were pure affection, fond teasing of beloved public figures who had enough goodwill accumulated that even the sharpest barb bounced off harmlessly. There have been jokes that were genuinely vicious, designed less to illuminate than to wound, aimed at people the writers clearly disliked. There have been jokes that landed in the cultural consciousness and refused to leave, becoming the thing many people think of first when they hear a certain name. And there have been jokes, a small and eerie collection of them, that the writers probably meant as absurdist hyperbole at the time, but which reality eventually caught up with and validated in ways that nobody anticipated. All of that is worth exploring. All of that is worth knowing. And the best part is that you do not have to do anything except listen. So let your breathing slow, let the day go. Let the sound of this story carry you somewhere quiet and interesting and just a little bit strange, the way Family Guy itself always has. We are going to start where most things start, at the beginning. And before we go any further into this wonderful, strange journey through 25 years of celebrity jokes, do us a favor. If you are enjoying this, leave a comment down below. Tell us your favorite Family Guy moment involving a real person. And if you have not subscribed yet, go ahead and do that now. We make these long, slow, relaxing explorations of pop culture every week, and you would not want to miss where we go next. The subscribe button is right there waiting for you, and it will not take more than a second. Now, let us continue. Section 2. The Presidents. From George W. Bush to the Oval Office revolving door. If there is one category of real person joke that has defined Family Guy more than any other, it is the political joke. And if there is one political target that the show returned to with the most sustained, gleeful, and occasionally brilliant creativity, it is the American presidency. From the earliest seasons, the show made clear that no matter who happened to be occupying the White House at any given moment, they were fair game. Not just fair game, in fact. They were a primary target, a recurring source of comedic raw material that the writers mined with the kind of enthusiastic persistence usually associated with people who have found something genuinely good and refuse to let it go. Let us start with George W. Bush. In many ways, the Bush years were Family Guy's formative political period. The show premiered in 1999, during the final stretch of the Clinton presidency, but by the time it was canceled in 2002 and then spectacularly revived in 2005, Bush had defined the national conversation in ways that no American president had since Watergate. The September 11th attacks, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the debate over weapons of mass destruction, the slow unwinding of American certainty about its own rightness and power. All of that formed the backdrop against which Family Guy was making its jokes, and the show did not pretend otherwise. The Bush jokes in Family Guy tended to cluster around a particular portrait of the man. Not evil, exactly, not a cartoon villain in the traditional sense, but profoundly and almost comically incurious, easily confused, given to malapropisms and tangled syntax, a man who had somehow arrived at the most powerful office in the world without seeming to have thought very hard about anything along the way. This was, of course, a caricature, the same caricature that Saturday Night Live was running with at the time, the same one that political cartoonists and late-night hosts were working from. But Family Guy had its own way of deploying it. One of the show's most effective techniques with Bush was the cutaway gag that placed him in a mundane, domestic setting, and then allowed his particular brand of confusion to play out in slow, excruciating detail. The joke was never really about policy or ideology. It was about competence, about the strange vertigo of watching a man who seemed to struggle with basic logic be placed in charge of the nuclear codes. There is something that lands in the pit of your stomach when you think about it too hard, and Family Guy seemed to understand that discomfort and lean directly into it. Peter Griffin, interestingly, shared some DNA with the Bush caricature. Both were large, friendly, somewhat dim men who moved through the world with a blithe confidence that their blunders never seemed to dent. This was probably not an accident. MacFarlane has been fairly open about the political underpinnings of the show's humor, and there is a reasonable argument to be made that Peter Griffin was, in part, a gentle satire of the kind of American male voter who put Bush in office, not malicious. Not thoughtful enough to be malicious, just stumbling happily through a world that his choices were making worse. The show also engaged with the broader political theater of the Bush era. The Iraq War was referenced repeatedly, usually with a kind of dark, absurdist energy that made the tragedy of it land differently than a straightforward political editorial would. There were jokes about the misleading intelligence that led to the invasion, jokes about the no-bid contracts and the corporate beneficiaries of the war, jokes that were angry underneath their comedic exterior, dressed up in cutaway gags and non-sequiturs, but pointed in a direction that any paying attention viewer could not miss. Then came Barack Obama, and the show's political humor had to recalibrate. Obama presented a different kind of challenge for satirists. He was, by any reasonable measure, a more conventionally competent person than his predecessor. Articulate, thoughtful, given to long, careful sentences rather than mangled ones. The easy targets that the Bush years had provided were gone. What replaced them was something more subtle. The gap between Obama's soaring rhetoric and the complicated, compromised reality of governing. The distance between the hope he represented and the imperfect results that hope could actually deliver. Family Guy found its way into this gap with some dexterity. The show was, in general, sympathetic to Obama. MacFarlane and the writing staff were not hiding their political sympathies in the Obama years, and the treatment of the president reflected that. But sympathy is not the same as absence of critique, and the show did manage to find angles on the Obama presidency that felt honest rather than sycophantic. One recurring element was the treatment of Obama as someone almost impossibly cool and competent in ways that made everyone around him look worse by comparison. This was a form of flattery, certainly, but it was also a way of getting at something real about the cultural weight Obama carried, the expectations that followed him everywhere, the particular burden of being the first black president in a country with a brutal and complicated racial history. When Family Guy made jokes about Obama's coolness, about his carefully managed public image, about the way his supporters sometimes tipped from admiration into uncritical worship, it was touching something true about how the country experienced those 8 years. The show also spent time on the political opposition to Obama, and here the jokes sharpened considerably. The Tea Party movement, the birther controversy, the specific flavor of fury that Obama's presidency seemed to inspire in certain quarters. Family Guy did not shy away from making clear what it thought was driving some of that opposition, and it did so in the blunt, unambiguous way that animated comedy can sometimes achieve when live-action television would still be hedging? Donald Trump is a name that requires its own careful consideration in the context of Family Guy, because the show's relationship with him spans a remarkably long time and underwent a remarkable transformation. Trump appeared in Family Guy long before he became a political figure of national consequence. In the early seasons, he appeared as a reference point for a particular kind of ostentatious, slightly vulgar American wealth. Not evil, not even particularly interesting, just a symbol of a certain kind of success that came packaged with gold fixtures and a very particular attitude toward taste and subtlety. The show actually featured Trump more directly in later seasons, and by the time of the 2016 election, the jokes had changed entirely in their character and intensity. What had been a fairly mild caricature of a rich guy who liked to see his name on buildings became something much darker and more urgent. The show, along with much of the entertainment industry, seemed genuinely unsettled by the political rise of someone it had previously treated as a harmless, if somewhat absurd, fixture of American pop culture. There is a particular irony here that the writers seemed aware of. Satire that treats someone as a joke, as merely ridiculous rather than dangerous, can inadvertently normalize them. If the joke is always that this person is too buffoonish to be taken seriously, you are implicitly making the argument that they are not worth serious concern. Family Guy, along with The Simpsons and Saturday Night Live and a dozen other institutions of American comedy, had to grapple with the question of whether their long history of treating Trump as comedic material had done anything to contribute to a culture that found his rise possible. There is no clean answer to that question. It probably does not have a clean answer, but it is the kind of question that arises when you look at the full arc of how this show engaged with the Trump phenomenon, from the mild early references through the increasingly alarmed later seasons. Bill Clinton, by contrast, was treated with a consistent warmth that probably reflected the genuine affection much of the creative community had for him, combined with a frankly acknowledged willingness to engage with the mess of his personal life. The Monica Lewinsky scandal, which had defined the final years of the Clinton presidency and contributed to the political climate of the early 2000s, was referenced in Family Guy with a mixture of knowing comedy and something that almost resembled sympathy. Clinton was portrayed as a deeply charming, politically gifted, personally self-destructive man who could never quite stop himself from reaching for things he should not have, a portrayal that felt less like satire and more like biography. The Clinton jokes also touched on something the show was interested in throughout its run: the gap between public persona and private reality. The way that political figures, like celebrities more broadly, construct a version of themselves for public consumption that is necessarily incomplete and often misleading. Clinton was perhaps the purest example of this in American political life of the late 20th century, a man whose public self was so polished, so warmly effective, that the private self, when it finally became public knowledge, seemed to many people like a betrayal. Family Guy was not particularly interested in moralizing about that gap. The show found it more interesting as a comic premise than as an ethical problem. But in using Clinton to explore it, the writers were doing something that went beyond the surface-level joke about a man who could not keep his trousers on. Joe Biden appeared in the show during his years as vice president under Obama, and the portrayal leaned heavily into his reputation for verbal gaffes and a certain unfiltered enthusiasm that occasionally led him to say things before he had finished thinking them through. This was gentler territory than the Bush jokes, more affectionate than the later Trump ones. Biden was someone the show seemed to like, in the way you like a well-meaning uncle who occasionally says something at Thanksgiving that makes everyone at the table wince slightly and then move quickly to a different subject. What is most interesting about all of these presidential portraits, taken together, is not any individual joke, but the cumulative picture they paint of how Family Guy understood political power. The show was consistently skeptical of it, consistently willing to puncture the solemnity that tends to surround the office of the presidency, but it was not nihilistic about it. The jokes were not saying that leadership does not matter or that the people who seek high office are all the same. They were saying something more nuanced. That power tends to reveal character, that the gap between what politicians say and what they do is always worth examining, and that the country's tendency to treat its presidents as either heroes or villains, rather than as complicated, flawed human beings with more agency than most, but less than their office implies, was itself a kind of problem. Not bad, for a show where a baby frequently threatens to kill his mother. The show also ventured into the terrain of presidential spouses, though with considerably more caution than it applied to the presidents themselves. Michelle Obama appeared in brief references as a figure of dignity and intelligence, treated with genuine respect even by the show's most irreverent writers. Hillary Clinton received more complex treatment, particularly in the years when she transitioned from First Lady to Senator to Secretary of State to presidential candidate. The show seemed genuinely unsure what to do with her, and the jokes ranged from affectionate to pointed to something that, on a few occasions, felt like it was reaching for a target it could not quite identify clearly. Melania Trump appeared occasionally in later seasons, always with a particular flavor of comedy that played on the gap between the life she had come from and the life she found herself in. The strangeness of the role she occupied, the opacity of her inner life that she maintained with considerable discipline throughout her years in the public eye. All of these figures, all of these portraits, add up to something like a political diary. Not an accurate one, not a complete one, but a record of how a particular group of writers, working in a particular American cultural moment, tried to make sense of the people who held power and what that power looked like from the outside. And that is worth something, even when the jokes did not land, maybe especially then. Section 3. James Woods, the show's greatest real person obsession. If you were going to write a thesis about Family Guy's relationship with real people, and some graduate student somewhere probably has, you would structure your entire argument around James Woods. Not around any president, not around any pop star, not around any of the genuinely newsworthy figures the show skewered over the years. You would start with James Woods, because James Woods is the example that makes everything else make sense. Here is the strange, beautiful, deeply weird story of how one of Hollywood's most respected character actors became the single most recurring real-person gag in the history of animated television. James Woods is, by any objective assessment, a remarkable actor. He has been nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actor. He has won 2 Emmy Awards. His filmography includes work in films that serious cinephiles will bring up in the same breath as the best American movies of the latter half of the 20th century. He played a convincing Roy Cohn in a television adaptation of Angels in America. He was extraordinary in Salvador. His presence in a film was, for a long stretch of his career, a reliable indicator that something interesting was going to happen. He also had a reputation, in Hollywood circles and eventually in broader public life, for being extraordinarily difficult. Brilliant, unquestionably, but difficult. The kind of difficult that comes with genius sometimes. The kind where the intelligence that makes you exceptional at your craft also makes you impatient with everyone and everything that is not operating at your level, which in a world like Hollywood, where a remarkable amount of work requires patience with things that are not quite at your level, creates consistent friction. Family Guy discovered James Woods sometime in the early seasons and did something that, in retrospect, was either inspired or very strange or both. It decided that the funniest possible version of James Woods was one where his defining characteristic was an extreme susceptibility to simple bait. The recurring joke was elemental. You could lure James Woods anywhere, trap him in any situation, get him to do essentially anything by laying a simple trail of candy. Specifically, a trail of Reese's Pieces, the peanut butter cups, left in a line on the ground, leading wherever you wanted him to go, and James Woods would follow it, every time, without fail. With complete, helpless inability to resist. It is such a simple joke that you might wonder why it works at all, and yet it does work, in the specific way that the most well-constructed absurdist comedy works, which is that it establishes a rule, and then follows that rule with perfect consistency. The rule is that James Woods will always follow the candy. What changes is the context in which this rule is applied, the locations and situations and consequences that follow from it, and the escalating absurdity of a man with his particular reputation and biography being unable to exercise even the most basic self-control when confronted with a handful of sweets on the floor. The joke is, on one level, about vanity, about the assumption that people who have achieved significant success, who have built impressive reputations, must be possessed of some unusual quality of self-discipline or willpower. The James Woods joke undercuts this assumption completely. Whatever makes James Woods remarkable at his work, the joke says, does not extend to the basic challenge of not picking up candy off the ground. But the joke is also, on another level, about the show's relationship with celebrity itself. Family Guy has always been fascinated by the gap between the image celebrities project and the reality of what they might actually be like if you encountered them in an ordinary setting. The James Woods gag takes that fascination to a logical extreme. What if the real James Woods, the one you would meet if you stumbled across him on a Tuesday afternoon, was just a man who really could not resist a trail of candy? James Woods appeared as himself in multiple episodes, and the writers gave him a fairly expansive role in each one. He was not simply a punchline to be deployed and forgotten. He had dialogue, motivation, a character arc within individual episodes that made him feel like more than a prop. This is part of what made the joke work so well over multiple seasons. The show seemed genuinely interested in the character it had constructed, even as that character was obviously a comic distortion of the real person. In one notable storyline, James Woods essentially replaces Peter Griffin in the Griffin family's social life, insinuating himself with such smooth charm that the family begins to prefer him to their actual patriarch. This was playing with something real about the actor's public persona: his intelligence, his social fluency, his ability to project warmth and interest when he chose to. The joke was not simply that James Woods was weird. The joke was that he was weird in a specifically compelling way, weird in a way that made him hard to resist, which circled back with elegant comic logic to the candy trail. What makes the James Woods relationship particularly interesting when you look at it with the benefit of time and distance is that it functioned as a genuine creative relationship of a peculiar kind. The show was making jokes about him, sometimes quite pointed ones, and the jokes were embedded in an obvious affection and fascination. MacFarlane and the writers seemed to find James Woods genuinely interesting as a human being, not just as a target. They were mining his public persona with the kind of attention you only pay to someone you actually find compelling. This is different from how the show treated most celebrities. With most real people, even the ones who appeared multiple times, there was always a sense that the show was using them to get at something else, that they were a vehicle for a joke whose real subject was something broader about culture or celebrity or American life. With James Woods, the joke always seemed to be primarily about James Woods himself, about this specific person and the specific weird energy he brought into the world. The show also explored James Woods through the lens of his later life political evolution. In the years after the show began using him as a recurring character, Woods became increasingly vocal about his own political views, which shifted considerably from where they had been earlier in his career. This created a new dimension to the jokes, a new layer of complexity to the portrait. The show, with its generally progressive sensibility, found itself in the position of having developed an elaborate and somewhat affectionate comedic relationship with someone who had become, in public life, increasingly associated with positions the show found objectionable. How it navigated this is instructive. Rather than simply abandoning the James Woods jokes or retroactively making them nastier to reflect the changed relationship, the show tended to operate in a kind of temporal suspension, where the James Woods of the animated universe existed slightly apart from the James Woods of current events. The candy trail jokes continued. The affectionate absurdism continued. The show seemed to make a kind of implicit argument that the version of someone that exists in your creative imagination does not need to be continuously updated to reflect every development in that person's real life. Whether that is artistically defensible is an interesting question. It is at the very least an honest reflection of how comedy often works, which is to say that it tends to crystallize its subjects at a particular moment and then continue working with that version of them even as the real person evolves or changes or does things that complicate the original portrait. The James Woods relationship also produced one of the show's genuinely clever meta-jokes, an episode in which Peter discovers that he and James Woods share a birthday, leading to a sustained sequence that played with the audience's accumulated knowledge of all the previous James Woods jokes. The show was, in that moment, acknowledging the mythology it had built around this particular person and using that mythology as raw material for further comedy. It was a show making jokes about its own jokes, using a real person as the hinge on which that meta-comedy turned. There is something slightly vertiginous about this when you look at it closely. James Woods, the actor, exists. James Woods, the Family Guy character, also exists in a different sense, but just as persistently. And over the course of the show's long run, those two versions of the same person have become so intertwined in the cultural imagination that it is genuinely difficult, if you have grown up watching the show, to hear the name James Woods without some association with candy and trails and the specific voice the show gave him. That is a strange kind of power that a piece of popular culture can have over a real person's public identity. Not necessarily a damaging power, not necessarily a kind one, just a power operating in the space between fiction and reality, doing something that probably nobody fully intended but that happened anyway, the way so many of the most interesting things happen. There are other actors who received similar sustained treatment over the show's run, though none quite matched James Woods in terms of the elaborateness of the mythology built around them. Ryan Reynolds appeared in jokes that played with his reputation as perhaps the most effortlessly charming man in Hollywood, a quality the show found simultaneously admirable and faintly absurd, as though anyone being that consistently pleasant must be getting away with something. Liam Neeson's transformation, in the later years of his career, from serious dramatic actor to action hero known primarily for a particular set of skills that he would find you and use to kill you, was a gift to comedy writers everywhere, and Family Guy was not about to pass it up. Patrick Stewart, perhaps best known to the public as the captain of the Enterprise and later as Professor Charles Xavier, appeared in gags that played with the magnificent gravity of his voice and bearing. The joke was always about the disconnect between that extraordinary voice, that presence, that sense of weight and consequence, and the mundane or absurd content it was being deployed to deliver. If you want to make something funny, give it to Patrick Stewart to say with complete sincerity, and the comedy will follow. Family Guy understood this intuitively. Hugh Laurie, the British comedian and actor who became an American television phenomenon through his role in House, appeared in jokes that delighted in the very American habit of forgetting that certain beloved performers are in fact British. The cognitive dissonance of meeting Hugh Laurie and expecting the American doctor from the hospital drama and getting instead a man whose natural accent sounds nothing like the character he played was endlessly rich territory. All of these actors, and many more, passed through the show's animated universe over the years. But James Woods is the one who stayed, the one who became part of the show's actual mythology rather than just its reference pool. The one whose presence in an episode meant something different from anyone else's presence, carried all that accumulated history, all those years of candy and trails and escalating absurdity. He is, in his own strange way, as much a part of Family Guy's identity as Peter Griffin himself. Section 4. Hollywood Legends, Mel Gibson, Charlton Heston, and the Old Guard. There is a particular kind of celebrity that Family Guy finds irresistible, and it is not the young, the flashy, or the newly famous. The show has a genuine appetite for a specific flavor of Hollywood elder statesman, the kind of actor or public figure who has been around long enough to accumulate both genuine achievement and genuine controversy, whose public persona is layered enough to reward the kind of sustained comedic attention the show prefers to give. Mel Gibson is perhaps the purest example of this category. Before everything that happened, before the recordings and the incidents and the long, complicated process of public reckoning that followed, Mel Gibson was one of the most successful people in Hollywood. Not just a successful actor, a successful director. A man who had made a film, Braveheart, that won 5 Academy Awards including Best Picture and Best Director, who had followed it with The Passion of the Christ, which became one of the highest-grossing films in history despite being almost entirely in dead languages, and having a marketing strategy that relied heavily on churches, and who was, for a stretch of years in the 1990s and early 2000s, the kind of bankable global movie star that studios build their entire release schedules around. He was also, clearly, a very complicated person. The complications became public knowledge in ways that nobody could ignore, and Family Guy was watching. The show's engagement with Gibson evolved across multiple periods. In the earlier phases, the jokes tended to focus on the particular religious intensity of The Passion of the Christ and what it suggested about the man who had made it. The film was a deliberate provocation, designed to be uncomfortable, drenched in suffering and blood, and a very specific theological worldview. Family Guy found this rich material, not because it was anti-religious, but because the film's particular combination of devotional sincerity and graphic violence was genuinely strange, and strange things are comedy's natural habitat. There were also jokes about Gibson's earlier career, about the Lethal Weapon franchise and the particular 1980s action movie energy it embodied, about the image of Mel Gibson as a man of action and adventure that had made him famous before any of the complications arose. These jokes were relatively gentle, the kind of fond teasing that you give to someone whose work you have actually spent time with and found something worth engaging in. The jokes changed sharply and permanently when Gibson's personal life became national news. The incidents that came to light in the mid-2000s, the recordings, the statements, the behavior that contradicted so sharply with the image he had constructed, gave the show material that was darker and less comfortable than what it had been working with before. Family Guy did not shy away from this material. The show incorporated it, made explicit reference to it, used it as the basis for jokes that were less fond and more pointed, jokes that seemed to be working through something rather than simply entertaining. What is interesting about the Gibson jokes in this later period is that they did not entirely abandon the complexity of the earlier portrait. The show seemed to hold both things at once, the genuine talent and achievement on one hand, the genuine toxicity and harm on the other. This is more difficult than it sounds. The easier comedic approach, once a public figure has done something genuinely bad, is to simply erase the prior portrait and replace it with a simple villain. Family Guy's Gibson jokes did not quite do this. They remained aware of the whole person, which made them simultaneously more uncomfortable and more honest than simple vilification would have been. Charlton Heston occupies an adjacent but distinct space in Family Guy's catalog of Hollywood legends. Heston is one of the most genuinely paradoxical figures in 20th century American public life. As an actor, he was the embodiment of epic grandeur, the kind of performer you cast when you need someone to carry a biblical epic or a Roman spectacle, whose physicality and bearing could fill a widescreen frame the way very few actors ever could. Ben-Hur, The Ten Commandments, El Cid, Planet of the Apes. These are films that exist in a different register than most of Hollywood's output, films that were trying to be genuinely monumental, and Heston was one of the few actors of his generation who could meet that ambition. He was also a civil rights activist in the 1960s, a detail that gets lost in later accounts of his life. He marched with Martin Luther King. He was present at events and in photographs that document the moral urgency of that movement in ways that demand respect. And then, much later, he became the public face of the National Rifle Association, serving as its president and delivering speeches that were designed to draw the sharpest possible lines around gun rights in America. His famous declaration at an NRA convention, holding a rifle above his head and daring any opponent to take it from his cold, dead hands, became one of the most quoted and most parodied moments in the long, complicated national argument about guns. Family Guy found this paradox irresistible. The jokes about Heston leaned heavily on the cold, dead hands imagery, returning to it with a persistence that suggested the writers found something almost cosmically funny about the gap between the prophet-leading-his-people energy of Heston's acting career and the firearm-clutching political persona of his later years. The same physical gravitas that served Moses now served the guns argument. The same thundering voice, the same raised arm. The joke was about the transferability of heroic imagery across entirely different contexts. There was also comedy in Heston's later years, when age and eventually Alzheimer's disease made the formidable physical presence of his prime seem even further away. Family Guy, which does not always handle its more uncomfortable material with great delicacy, found ways to acknowledge this that were occasionally cruel but not entirely without an underlying recognition that this is simply what time does, even to people who once seemed made of something more durable than flesh. The show also spent time with other Hollywood legends of a similar vintage. Walter Matthau, Jack Lemmon, Paul Newman, Steve McQueen in retrospective jokes that acknowledge their iconic status while finding angles of comedy in the specific textures of their personas. These older generation Hollywood jokes tended to be warmer than the show's treatment of contemporary celebrities, as though time had softened whatever edge might have once been there and left only affection. Frank Sinatra received particular attention, both directly and through the lens of the Rat Pack more broadly. Sinatra is one of those cultural figures whose mythology is so enormous, so thoroughly constructed and reinforced over so many decades, that comedy almost cannot help engaging with it. The voice, the suits, the particular brand of masculine cool that he perfected and that dozens of imitators and admirers spent their careers trying to approximate. Family Guy approached Sinatra with something close to reverence underneath the jokes. The way you sometimes approach a thing you genuinely love and find so overwhelming in its importance that you have to make fun of it simply to be able to handle being in its presence. Clint Eastwood is another figure who appeared in jokes that were largely about the durability of a specific kind of male persona. Eastwood built a career on silence and implied violence, on characters who spoke little but meant everything they said, who stood in landscapes that dwarfed them and were not dwarfed by them. The comedy in Eastwood jokes almost always comes from the extreme economy of his public self, the way he seems to have stripped away everything unnecessary and left only the essential minimum. Family Guy, which tends toward maximalism, found in Eastwood's minimalism a natural comic counterpoint. Arnold Schwarzenegger appeared in jokes that occupied an interesting middle ground between the Hollywood legend category and the political category, because Schwarzenegger was both. He was genuinely one of the biggest movie stars in the world for a significant portion of the show's run, and then he became the governor of California, and both of these things provided material, the accent, the specific syntax of his public speaking, the extraordinary improbability of his biography, which, if presented as fiction, would be rejected as too unbelievable. An Austrian bodybuilder becomes the most famous action star in Hollywood and then wins election as the governor of the most populous state in America. As a narrative arc, it defies all reasonable expectation. Family Guy understood the comedy inherent in Schwarzenegger's story, which is the comedy of pure, unfiltered American possibility in its most outlandish form. And it returned to that comedy with affection, because there is something genuinely lovable about a story that absurd actually being true. Jack Nicholson rounds out the landscape of Hollywood legends the show engaged with most substantially. Nicholson's particular brand of manic intelligence, the eyebrows, the grin, the sense that he is always about 10% more aware of what is happening in any given situation than anyone else in the room, and finds this both amusing and slightly wearying, was a gift to any comedy writers working in his shadow. The Nicholson impressions that appeared in Family Guy were not always the most technically precise, but they always captured the energy correctly. That particular frequency of knowing, sardonic amusement that he carried through everything from The Shining to As Good as It Gets. The Hollywood legend category also extended to directors. Steven Spielberg appeared in jokes that touched on his extraordinary commercial success and the specific emotion engineering quality of his best-known work. The way his films are designed with almost architectural precision to make audiences cry at particular moments. This is not an insult. It is a remarkable skill. But it is also a skill that lends itself to comedy. The comedy of recognizing the machinery behind the emotion and marveling at how well it works, even when you can see the gears turning. George Lucas appeared primarily in the context of the Star Wars parody episodes, which we will address in more depth when we reach the section on the show's extended relationship with science fiction and fantasy. For now, it is enough to note that the show treated Lucas with a complexity that mirrored the broader cultural relationship with his legacy. Enormous admiration for the original trilogy, genuine bewilderment at the prequel era, and a kind of sad acknowledgement that some of the most beloved things in the world can become disappointing when their creators return to them after long absences. All of these Hollywood legends, taken together, reveal something about the show's deepest comedic instincts. Family Guy is fundamentally interested in mythology. In the stories we tell about exceptional people, the stories those people tell about themselves, and the gap between those stories and the more complicated, more human reality underneath. The Hollywood legend category is perfect material for this kind of comedy because the myth-making apparatus of Hollywood is so enormous, so effective, and so persistent that it creates vast gaps to work with, vast spaces between the legend and the person that comedy can move through freely. The show moved through those spaces with characteristic irreverence, but it also, in its best moments, moved through them with something like wisdom. Section 5. The Music World Beatles, Michael Jackson, Britney Spears, and the sound of a generation. Music and comedy have always had a complicated relationship. Not unlike siblings who grew up in the same house and share certain deep-seated traits while simultaneously resenting each other's success. Family Guy understood this relationship intuitively and used it throughout its run with remarkable creative range. The show's engagement with the world of popular music spans everything from gentle, affectionate tribute to scathing satire, from extended musical sequences that demonstrate genuine love for the art form to quick, savage punchlines that sacrifice any complexity for the sake of a laugh. The Beatles are where we have to start, because the Beatles are where Family Guy returns most consistently when it reaches for musical touchstones. There is something genuinely interesting about how the show engaged with the Beatles, because the Beatles present a particular challenge for any satirist or comedian. They are so universally beloved, their place in musical history so thoroughly secured, their cultural significance so enormous, that finding a comedic angle on them requires either genuine originality or a willingness to go somewhere darker than most comedy wants to go. The easy joke about the Beatles is not really a joke at all, just an acknowledgement of how important they were, which is not funny because it is simply true and everybody knows it. Family Guy found its angles in the specific textures of the individual members rather than in the band as a collective institution. Paul McCartney appeared in jokes that touched on his extraordinary career longevity, his seemingly inexhaustible melodic gifts, and his particular public persona, which is warm and charming and somewhat relentlessly positive, in a way that the show found, if not suspicious, then at least worth examining. The late career McCartney, still touring, still releasing albums, still finding new audiences decades after most artists would have stopped trying, was treated with a mixture of genuine admiration and gentle amusement at the sheer scale of the man's ambition and energy. John Lennon, dead since 1980, appeared in the show primarily as a kind of sacred figure, someone whose shadow was large enough to cast comedy in a different direction than it usually went. The jokes about Lennon tended to deal with the mythology that had accumulated around him after his death, the way he had been transformed from a complicated, sometimes difficult, sometimes brilliant, sometimes wrong person into something closer to a saint. The comedy was in the gap between the historical Lennon, who was funny and cruel and tender and jealous and generous and petty in approximately the same proportions as any other remarkable human being, and the Lennon of legend, who had been smoothed down and polished until all the difficult edges were gone. George Harrison, the quiet Beatle, received the kind of treatment that quieter, less obviously dramatic public figures tend to receive. Jokes that played with his specific quality of reserve, his spiritual searching, the way his post-Beatles career seemed to operate on a different frequency than Paul's relentless accessibility or John's confrontational celebrity. The spiritual dimension of Harrison's later life, his interest in Eastern religion and philosophy, was treated with a mixture of affection and mild comedy that avoided both mockery and reverence, landing somewhere in between that felt about right. Ringo Starr appeared in jokes that engaged with the long-running debate about his place in the Beatles' hierarchy, the argument that had been running since approximately 1965 about whether he was the best drummer in the world or simply the best drummer in the Beatles. The show found this debate funnier than almost anything else about the Beatles, probably because it reveals so much about the absurdity of trying to rank exceptional talent on an absolute scale. Michael Jackson is a name that requires more careful navigation than almost any other in this entire story, because what Michael Jackson means has changed so profoundly over the years, the decades, the long arc of public reassessment, that any fixed portrait of him is necessarily incomplete. Family Guy engaged with Michael Jackson at different points and in different registers. The early jokes, from the periods when Jackson was primarily understood as an eccentric but undeniably gifted pop star, focused on his appearance, his behavior, his extraordinary strangeness as a public persona. These jokes were broadly similar to what Saturday Night Live and every other comedy institution of the era was doing, taking the specific weirdness of Jackson's public self and amplifying it for comedic effect. The show went further than most comedy institutions were willing to go when it cast someone to voice a character who was explicitly stated to be Michael Jackson in the episode. The episode in question is a strange and fascinating piece of television, not simply because of the casting, but because of how it handled the Jackson persona. The episode is tender in ways that were unexpected, finding in Jackson a quality of vulnerability and loneliness that the usual caricature tended to miss. The joke was not entirely a joke. There was something genuinely sad in the portrait, something that acknowledged the extraordinary cost of the kind of fame Jackson had lived with, the way it had deformed ordinary human experience for him in ways that were probably beyond repair. After the revelations that emerged following Jackson's death and the subsequent documentary that reframed his public legacy, the Jackson material became more complicated to revisit. The show found itself in the position of having made jokes that, in retrospect, felt less like comedy and more like uncomfortable proximity to something very dark. This is a position that many comedy institutions found themselves in during this period, wrestling with the question of how you handle creative work that was made in good faith about someone who turned out to have done terrible things. Britney Spears received extensive and evolving treatment across the show's run, and the arc of that treatment tells you something important about how the culture's relationship with her shifted over time. In the early and mid-2000s, when Britney Spears was at the peak of her commercial success and cultural visibility, the Family Guy jokes about her tended to focus on the specific brand of highly manufactured pop celebrity that she represented, the way her image was constructed and packaged and sold, the gap between the performer and the person. These jokes were part of a broader cultural conversation that treated Spears as a kind of cultural product rather than a fully realized individual, and they did not age particularly well. The later period, when Spears' personal struggles became extremely public, when she went through a very visible and very difficult period of her life, under conditions that would have been challenging for anyone, but were made infinitely more challenging by the complete absence of privacy, when the conservatorship that had controlled her life for years became a matter of public controversy and genuine concern, these later jokes were considerably more uncomfortable to revisit. Not because Family Guy was uniquely cruel, but because the show was a participant in a broader cultural practice of treating a real woman's pain as entertainment, and that practice looks different now than it did when it was happening. The show eventually adjusted its tone in relation to Spears, as the broader culture did, moving towards something more sympathetic as the full picture of what she had been through became clearer. But the early material remains in the archive, a record of a cultural moment that the culture itself has since reconsidered. Whitney Houston appeared in jokes that, before her death, focused on the specific spectacular quality of her voice and the specific spectacular quality of the troubles that seemed to follow her. The contrast between transcendent gift and evident struggle. After her death in 2012, the jokes stopped, as they tend to do, replaced by the kind of respectful silence that usually descends on public figures once they are gone. But the pre-death material is still there, still doing what it was doing, still asking uncomfortable questions about what it means to make comedy out of someone else's suffering. Madonna is a figure Family Guy returned to with considerable frequency, finding in her extraordinary career a source of comic material that was almost inexhaustible. The jokes about Madonna were primarily about transformation, about the relentless reinvention that had defined her career from the very beginning and that continued even when reinvention seemed impossible. There is genuine comedy in the idea of someone who has already been so many different versions of herself that you lose count, who treats identity not as something fixed and given, but as something to be worked on and revised, and discarded and rebuilt, who has been doing this for so long that the reinventions themselves have become a kind of tradition. The show also spent time on Madonna's accent, specifically the accent she developed during her time in Britain, which became a subject of considerable public interest and comedy. The accent was not quite British and not quite American, and was received by both British and American audiences with varying degrees of bewilderment. Family Guy, which had no particular agenda regarding Madonna one way or another, simply found it funny, which is a defensible position. Prince received treatment that was, if anything, more reverent than the show usually managed, probably because his talent was so self-evident and his persona so impenetrable that even the show's sharpest writers could not quite find a foothold. The jokes about Prince were less about him than about the world's reaction to him, the way people who encountered him tended to walk away with stories that sounded almost mythological, the way his privacy was so total and so deliberate that it made his public performances seem even more extraordinary by contrast. He existed in a protected universe that comedy could not quite penetrate, which is itself a remarkable achievement. David Bowie, who appeared in jokes throughout his lifetime and whose death in 2016 generated a wave of grief that took many people by surprise with its intensity, was treated with the kind of appreciation that the show generally reserved for figures who had genuinely expanded what popular art was capable of. The jokes about Bowie were loving, the way you make jokes about someone you are genuinely grateful for. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, the surviving core of the Rolling Stones, appeared in jokes that were almost always about longevity, about the extraordinary improbability of their continued existence, given what they had put their bodies through. About the specific quality of rock and roll myth-making that had kept the Stones relevant across multiple generations. There is something almost supernatural about the Stones' persistence, something that comedy can only approach sideways, and Family Guy tended to approach it sideways through jokes about Keith Richards' apparent immunity to the laws of biology, which have been funny for 30 years and show no signs of stopping. The Music World sections of Family Guy also extended to hip-hop, though with an unevenness that occasionally reflected the show's complicated relationship with Black American culture more broadly. Eminem appeared in jokes that engaged with his extraordinary commercial success and the specific controversy that followed him, the questions about his place in a musical tradition that did not originate with him, the anger and defensiveness and occasional brilliance of his public persona. Jay-Z appeared primarily as a reference point for commercial success of a particular order, a symbol of the intersection of artistic achievement and business empire. Kanye West received treatment that evolved substantially as his own public persona evolved, from celebrated producer and rapper to figure of controversy in ways that mirrored his real-life trajectory, and the show seemed genuinely unsure. At various points, whether it was laughing with him or at him, the music section of Family Guy's real-person comedy is ultimately a record of how popular music functions in American cultural life, not just as entertainment but as a mirror, a way of seeing the culture's values and anxieties and aspirations reflected back in a form that is more emotionally immediate than almost any other kind of art. The show used its musical references to access emotions that its comedy alone could not quite reach, to open doors in the audience's experience that a purely comedic approach would have kept closed. That is not nothing. In a show that could easily have been nothing but jokes, it is actually quite a lot. Section 6. O.J. Simpson. The Juice is Loose and the Court of Public Opinion. If there is a single moment in the history of American celebrity culture that changed everything, a moment that permanently altered the relationship between public figures and the public that watched them, it is the O.J. Simpson trial of 1994 and 1995. Not just the verdict, the whole thing. The white Bronco, the glove, the courtroom theater. The months of testimony and argument and speculation that turned legal proceedings into something that functioned in the national consciousness more like a very long, very strange television event than like a process of seeking justice. Family Guy was not on the air when the trial happened, but it was made by people who had watched it, who had been teenagers or young adults when it consumed the national conversation, who had absorbed its lessons about celebrity and race and money and the law. And when the show did engage with O.J. Simpson, it did so with a directness and a specificity that reflected genuine engagement with what the trial had meant, rather than simply using it as a reference point. The episode known in fan circles as The Juice is Loose is one of the show's most ambitious attempts to use a real person as the center of a sustained comedic argument. In it, Peter Griffin wins a contest, and the prize turns out to be a chance to spend the day with O.J. Simpson himself. What follows is a long, increasingly dark comic sequence in which Peter is convinced that O.J. is innocent, refuses to see the evidence in front of him, and cheerfully accompanies this man through situations that grow increasingly suspicious while maintaining his complete, impervious belief that nothing bad has happened. The joke has multiple targets, and this is worth noting. Yes, O.J. Simpson is in the frame, but the main target of the comedy is actually Peter, specifically the quality of willful blindness that allows him to ignore overwhelming evidence. Peter is a stand-in for a certain kind of American denial, the specific cultural habit of refusing to see what is directly in front of you because seeing it would require doing something uncomfortable about it. The O.J. material is the vehicle. The cultural critique is the actual destination. This is more sophisticated than the show usually gets credit for, and it is worth pausing on that sophistication for a moment. The question of O.J. Simpson's guilt or innocence is one of the most racially loaded questions in late 20th century American life. The criminal trial's acquittal was received very differently by Black Americans and white Americans, reflecting fundamental differences in how those communities experienced the criminal justice system and their confidence or lack thereof in its fairness. The civil trial, which found Simpson liable for the deaths, added another layer. The years since, including Simpson's eventual imprisonment on separate charges, added more. The whole situation is a tangled web of race and class and celebrity and evidence and what we choose to believe and why. Family Guy did not resolve any of this. It did not pretend to have a clean answer. What it did was take the cultural phenomenon of O.J. Simpson, the way that name functions as a kind of shorthand for a whole universe of questions about American justice and race and celebrity, and use it as a lens to look at something it was always more interested in anyway: how people decide what to believe, and how those decisions reveal the shape of their desires rather than the shape of the evidence. The episode also played with something specific about O.J. Simpson's post-trial behavior, which was itself a rich source of dark comedy. The way he gave interviews, the way he appeared in public, the particular combination of defiance and performance that characterized his public persona after the acquittal, all of this was material that the show mined carefully. There is a comedy of nerve to O.J. Simpson's post-trial life, a comedy of sheer audacity, and the show recognized it. What is also true is that the O.J. material was made at a time when the cultural conversation about the trial had shifted somewhat from the raw, immediate emotions of the verdict. Time creates a certain distance, and comedy needs distance to function. The show was not making these jokes in 1995, when the wounds were still open and the division still raw. It was making them a decade later, when the distance was large enough for comedy to operate, while the resonance was still strong enough to make the comedy matter. The broader question the O.J. episode raises is one that applies throughout Family Guy's engagement with real-person comedy. What is the ethical difference between making a joke about a public figure for the purposes of social commentary versus making a joke about a public figure simply because their name is recognizable and their misfortunes are widely known? This is a genuine distinction, and not all comedy makes it. There is a lazy category of real-person joke that uses someone's name simply as a trigger, a reference that produces a response in the audience based purely on recognition, without saying anything particular about the person or about the world. These jokes are plentiful in Family Guy. They are also plentiful everywhere else. They are the path of least resistance. The O.J. material is not this kind of joke, at its best. At its best, it is using the specific, loaded, culturally resonant story of O.J. Simpson to say something about how Americans process evidence, how celebrity mediates justice, how race shapes perception, and how willful blindness functions as a survival mechanism for people who find certain truths too uncomfortable to acknowledge. These are not small things to be saying. They are things worth saying. The trial also gave the show material in the form of the specific cast of characters who surrounded it. Johnny Cochran, the defense attorney whose "if it doesn't fit, you must acquit" closing argument became one of the most famous phrases in American legal history, appeared in Family Guy jokes that played with both the specific rhetorical genius of that moment and the broader question of whether rhetorical genius in the service of acquittal is the same thing as justice. The jokes were about the gap between winning and being right, between the rules of the game and the purpose the game is supposed to serve. Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden, the prosecutors, appeared in material that was generally more sympathetic, reflecting the show's apparent sense that the prosecution was trying to do something right, even if it failed. The failure itself, the way the case fell apart under the pressure of its own contradictions and under the assault of a defense team that outmaneuvered it at crucial moments, was material the show found both comic and genuinely tragic. Judge Lance Ito, who presided over the trial with a quality of judicial management that was the subject of considerable criticism, appeared in jokes that touched on the strange spectacle of the trial itself, the way it became a television event that operated by the logic of entertainment as much as by the logic of law. The O.J. material, taken as a whole, is some of the show's most substantive engagement with real events and their cultural aftermath. It is not always comfortable. It is not always fair, but it is always doing something more than simply name-dropping a famous person for cheap recognition, and in the landscape of Family Guy's long run, that distinction matters. There is something else worth noting about the O.J. episodes that is easy to miss: the show's consistent awareness of the racial dimension of the story. Family Guy has been criticized, with some justification, for its treatment of race over the years, for jokes that sometimes punched at targets that were not entirely defensible, for a kind of carelessness about certain racial stereotypes that could be uncomfortable. These criticisms are fair and have been made by people who engage seriously with the show's content. But the OJ material tends to be one of the places where the show showed more awareness than usual. The way the episode is constructed, with Peter's blindness as the primary target rather than Simpson himself, reflects an understanding that the trial was not simply about one man, but about the whole infrastructure of American racial injustice that provided the context in which the verdict made sense to a significant portion of the country. The joke was not that the verdict was obviously wrong and people who believed otherwise were fools. The joke was more complicated than that and more honest. As we continue through the show's long catalog of real-person comedy, the OJ material stands as a useful benchmark. When the show is working at this level of ambition, when it is using celebrity and notoriety as a way of getting at something true about American culture, it is doing something that justifies the discomfort it sometimes creates. Not every joke in the catalog meets that bar. Many fall short of it. But the bar exists, and the OJ material is one of the clearest places where the show reached it. Section 7. The Scandal Prophets. Kevin Spacey, Harvey Weinstein, and the Unsettling Predictions. There is a particular category of Family Guy joke that does not fit neatly anywhere else, a category that resists easy classification and that generates a specific, unsettling feeling when you encounter it in retrospect. These are the jokes that, at the time of their creation, were understood as exaggeration, as satirical distortion, as the kind of obvious comic overstatement that comedy has always used to get at targets that might otherwise be too difficult to approach directly. The jokes that were clearly hyperbole, clearly not meant to be taken literally. And then, years later, sometimes a decade or more later, reality caught up with them. Kevin Spacey is the most prominent example in this specific category. Kevin Spacey, before the autumn of 2017, was one of the most critically respected actors working in American film and television. His resume was extraordinary. The Usual Suspects, in which he played a character whose final revelation is one of the most discussed twist endings in modern film. American Beauty, for which he won the Academy Award for Best Actor. C7N. L.A. Confidential. House of Cards, the American version, in which his portrayal of a ruthless, charming, thoroughly amoral politician made the show appointment television for multiple seasons. He was the kind of actor that other actors spoke about in hushed tones, a genuine master of his craft. Family Guy made jokes about Kevin Spacey that were, in retrospect, not really jokes. The jokes operated in the register of the obvious open secret, the thing that everyone in a particular industry knows but that has not yet made its way into the mainstream press, the thing that gets said in certain rooms, and at certain parties, and in certain whisper networks. But that has not yet crossed the threshold into public knowledge. The jokes were about behavior that would later be described in dozens of first-hand accounts. Behavior that, when it finally became public in the wave of revelations that followed the initial reports about Harvey Weinstein, confirmed what the jokes had been suggesting all along. Seth MacFarlane has addressed this directly in public statements and interviews. He acknowledged that he had heard things, that the jokes were not invented from nothing, that they were based on the same whisper network information that had been circulating in Hollywood for years. This is a significant admission, and it raises a question that does not have a comfortable answer. When you know something bad is happening, or when you strongly suspect it, and you put that knowledge or suspicion into a comedy in the form of a joke, what have you done? You have not blown the whistle. You have not created the conditions for accountability. You have not helped any of the people who were harmed, but you have preserved the information in a form that is publicly accessible, that is part of the record, that could theoretically have led someone to investigate further. The joke is simultaneously an act of awareness and an act of avoidance, a way of acknowledging something without fully acknowledging it, of saying the unsayable without quite saying it. MacFarlane himself seemed to wrestle with this question publicly, acknowledging that the joke might have done more harm than good by contributing to a culture where this kind of behavior was treated as a punchline rather than as a crime, where the open secret was allowed to remain a secret precisely because the comedy served as a pressure valve, a way of releasing some of the tension without ever doing anything about the source of the tension. Harvey Weinstein is the figure whose exposure triggered the largest wave of revelations in 2017, and his name also appeared in Family Guy material before his exposure. The jokes about Weinstein were even less subtle than the Spacey ones, operating in the specific register of Hollywood power dynamics and the specific ways those dynamics could be abused. The entertainment industry has its own geography of power, and Weinstein occupied a particular summit of that geography for many years. A producer whose ability to greenlight films, to make careers, to put films in front of Academy voters was so enormous that his approval was something many people felt they needed, and his disapproval was something they felt they could not afford. The jokes about Weinstein before his exposure were about this power in a general sense. They were about the transactional quality of Hollywood relationships, about the way success in that industry requires access to specific people who control specific resources, and about what access to those people sometimes costs. These jokes were dark, darker than most Family Guy comedy, and they were not received as the kind of knowing wink that the industry whisper network would have recognized. They were received, by most of the audience, as simply comic exaggeration about a famously difficult industry. When the truth came out, those jokes became something different entirely. There is a broader pattern here worth examining. Family Guy's writers were not alone in making this kind of joke in this kind of register. The open secret about behavior in the entertainment industry existed in many forms, was preserved in many places, and was processed by many people as comedy rather than as information that demanded action. The culture had developed a sophisticated mechanism for acknowledging harm without addressing it, for making the evidence publicly available in the form of jokes, while simultaneously ensuring that the jokes would not be taken seriously enough to constitute actual accountability. This is worth sitting with, even in a context like this one where we are primarily exploring the history of a television show. The jokes were funny, in the specific uncomfortable way that comedy about very dark things can be funny. But the things they were pointing at were not funny, and the function that the comedy served in allowing those things to continue was not funny either. The show also engaged with the broader cultural phenomenon of the Me Too movement once it became public, attempting to address the complicated territory it had entered with the pre-exposure jokes. These later episodes varied in quality and in the sophistication of their engagement with the underlying issues. Some handled the transition with more grace than others. The show did not entirely solve the problem of having been a participant in the culture it was now trying to critique, but it did attempt to engage with that problem honestly, which is more than can be said for many of the institutions that found themselves in similar positions. There are other, smaller examples of this predictive quality in Family Guy's real-person comedy. References to figures who would later be found to have done serious things, jokes that at the time seemed like simple exaggeration but that in retrospect read as commentary, as warning, as the preserved evidence of what the people making the show had heard and could not yet say directly. The cumulative effect of all of these examples is to give the show's real-person comedy a dimension that most comedy does not have: the dimension of time. These are not just jokes that were made in the moment. They are artifacts of a particular cultural moment, preserved in amber, and when you look at them from the right distance and the right angle, you can see things in them that were not visible when they were first made. This is one of the reasons that Family Guy's long run is worth taking seriously as a cultural document, even when the individual jokes fall short of any standard of artistry or responsibility. The archive is a record of what people knew, or suspected, or feared, and how they chose to encode that knowledge in a form that was publicly accessible but safely deniable. It is also a reminder that comedy is never entirely innocent. It is never simply entertainment, never purely a mechanism for generating laughter without consequence. It operates in the world, it shapes the world. It helps determine what is speakable and what is not, what can be acknowledged openly, and what must remain in the shadows of the open secret. Family Guy, with all its flaws and all its occasional brilliance, is one of the clearest examples of this principle that American television has produced. Section 8. Sports stars Tom Brady, Deflategate, and the national religion of football. America has many religions, and the most widely practiced one has nothing to do with any deity. It is football. Specifically, the professional kind, the National Football League kind, the kind that commands the biggest television audiences in the country, generates billions of dollars annually, and turns the athletes who play it into figures of cultural significance that far outstrips what any reasonable analysis of throwing or catching a ball would seem to justify. Family Guy understood this about America early and used it throughout its run with consistent effectiveness. Tom Brady is the first name you reach when you start examining the show's relationship with professional sports, and that makes sense, because Tom Brady is the first name you reach in almost any discussion of American sports over the past 25 years. Brady played for the New England Patriots for 20 years. The Patriots won 6 Super Bowl championships during those years. Brady himself won 7 total, adding 1 more with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers before his retirement in 2023. His statistical record is extraordinary by any measure. His longevity in a sport that tends to grind its players into early retirement is almost inexplicable. His combination of sustained excellence and physical durability in a game that specializes in breaking bodies created a mythology around him that went far beyond any single statistic. The show is set in a fictional Rhode Island town, which means it exists in Patriots country. This geographic positioning gave the show a specific relationship to Brady that other animated comedies did not have. The Patriots were not just a team that the Griffin family might root for in the abstract. They were the local team, the cultural institution of their specific community, the thing that brought people together at bars and living rooms across the region every autumn Sunday. Brady appeared in Family Guy primarily as a figure of almost unreasonable perfection, and this is actually a more interesting comedic angle than simple mockery would have been. The comedy in the Brady material was not the comedy of failure or flaw. It was the comedy of excess, of achievement so sustained and so total that it begins to seem less like human accomplishment and more like a performance of human accomplishment by something that is not quite human. Brady never seemed to age. Brady never seemed to struggle. Brady always seemed to find a way to win when it mattered most, with the specific calm of someone who has done this so many times that the urgency of the moment has long since ceased to affect him. This is funny, in a specific way. There is a comedy to perfection that is different from the comedy of imperfection, and it requires a different kind of craft to execute. The jokes about Brady worked best when they took his specific brand of physical and professional perfection and placed it in a context that highlighted its absurdity. By contrast, when the serenity that worked so beautifully on a football field was transplanted into an ordinary, domestic, or chaotic context where it was simply bizarre. The Deflategate scandal of 2015 gave the show new and richer material. For those who need a refresher, the scandal arose from allegations that the Patriots had deliberately deflated footballs used in a playoff game against the Indianapolis Colts to a pressure level below the legal minimum, making the ball easier to handle and potentially giving the team an illegal advantage. Brady was implicated in the controversy, suspended by the league, then saw that suspension overturned on appeal, then saw a subsequent court ruling uphold the suspension in a legal process that dragged on for years and generated an enormous amount of public discussion for something that was, at its core, a controversy about the air pressure in balls. Family Guy found this absolutely irresistible, not because it was particularly invested in the specifics of football regulation, but because the whole situation illustrated something deeply funny about how American sports culture works. The level of passion and analysis devoted to the Deflategate controversy was completely disproportionate to the stakes involved. Whether a football was slightly underinflated or not is not, in any objective sense, a matter of great consequence. And yet it consumed enormous amounts of public attention, generated multiple legal proceedings, and became a lens through which people expressed their feelings about Brady himself, about the Patriots, about what kind of winner is acceptable, and what kind crosses a line. The show used the Deflategate material to make jokes about sports tribalism, about the specific irrationality of the passion that people bring to their team's fortunes, about the way a small and genuinely trivial controversy can become enormously meaningful when it is attached to figures who carry larger symbolic weight. Brady as perfect champion, Brady as cheater, Brady as victim of a witch hunt, or Brady as perpetrator of a conspiracy, depending entirely on which team you rooted for. The show found all of these interpretations, and the fury they generated both funny and revealing. Bill Belichick, Brady's head coach for most of his Patriots career, appeared in the margins of the Brady material and occasionally in his own right. Belichick presents a different comedic profile from Brady. Where Brady is glamorous and serene, Belichick is famously dour, famously terse in press conferences, famously committed to a level of professional opacity that has become its own kind of legend. The jokes about Belichick tended to focus on this quality of radical incompletion in his public communication, the way he would answer questions with the absolute minimum number of words required and sometimes fewer. The show also found material in the broader Patriots dynasty and what it meant to its regional fan base. New England had been sports-starved for decades before the Brady-Belichick era, and the success that followed was received with a fervor that contained within it all the accumulated longing of the lean years. Family Guy, set in this community, found ways to capture both the genuine joy of prolonged winning and the specific, defensive sensitivity that long-suffering sports fans tend to develop even after their suffering has ended. Beyond the Patriots and Brady, the show made extensive use of other professional sports figures. LeBron James appeared in jokes that engaged with his extraordinary talent, his business acumen, his carefully constructed public image, and the ongoing debate about his place in the hierarchy of basketball history. The Jordan versus LeBron argument, which has been one of the longest-running arguments in American sports conversation, made its way into Family Guy in ways that reflected the show's general interest in how people invest their identity in positions that are ultimately unprovable. Kobe Bryant, during his lifetime, appeared in material that reflected his complex public persona. The combination of genuine, extraordinary athletic achievement and the serious allegations that had been made against him in 2003 created a portrait that was genuinely difficult to simplify. And the show did not always navigate that difficulty gracefully. After his death in January 2020, the references stopped entirely, as they did with most public figures who died. The show engaged with the specific institution of the Super Bowl in ways that went beyond any individual player. The Super Bowl is one of those events that has become so large and so central to American cultural life that it functions as something beyond a sports event. It is a shared national experience, a moment of collective ritual that brings together people who have no interest in football alongside people who have devoted significant portions of their lives to understanding it. Family Guy set multiple episodes in and around Super Bowl events, using the specific social dynamics of Super Bowl parties, the commercials, the halftime show, as material. The halftime show in particular provided material that the show returned to multiple times. The halftime show is a uniquely American art form, a spectacular of spectaculars, a performance event that is simultaneously trying to satisfy an audience of hundreds of millions of people with very different musical tastes, to generate enough visual excitement to retain attention during a break in a sporting event, to create moments that will be discussed and shared for days afterward. The performers who accept this challenge, and the results they produce, are inexhaustible comedy material. Family Guy seemed to understand this. Baseball, the older national pastime, appeared less frequently in the show's sports material, probably because baseball's cultural centrality has declined somewhat relative to football during the period the show has been on the air. But Barry Bonds appeared in material that engaged with the steroid era of baseball, the period when home run records were being shattered with suspicious frequency, and the conversation about performance-enhancing drugs was beginning to make its way from whispers into headlines. Bonds, like the OJ material, gave the show a chance to examine how people decide what they want to believe about their heroes when the evidence points somewhere uncomfortable. The sports material in Family Guy reflects something important about the show's broader relationship with American culture. Sport is not just entertainment in this country. It is one of the primary mechanisms through which communities construct their identities, through which individual achievement is translated into collective pride, through which values are expressed and debated and revised. When the show makes jokes about Tom Brady or LeBron James or the Patriots dynasty, it is making jokes about these deeper things, using the sports material as a lens to look at something more fundamental about how Americans understand excellence and failure, winning and losing, rules and the flexibility of rules when the stakes are high enough. The comedy is lighter than that description suggests, but the subject matter is not entirely light, and the show knows it. Section 9. Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, and the political commentators. If the presidents gave Family Guy its most obvious political targets, the political commentators gave it something more interesting. The people who shaped how millions of Americans thought about the presidents. The opinion makers. The voices that occupied the airwaves and told their audiences how to interpret what they were seeing, how to feel about it, whose side they were on and whose side they needed to be against. Rush Limbaugh was, for about 3 decades, the most listened-to voice in American talk radio. His program reached tens of millions of people every week. His influence on Republican politics was so significant that multiple presidents felt the need to maintain a relationship with him and politicians who crossed him could find themselves facing organized opposition from his audience. He was not just a commentator. He was an institution, a force in American political life that had no real equivalent on the other side of the political spectrum, and that shaped the landscape of political media in ways that are still being felt long after his death in 2021. Family Guy found Rush Limbaugh interesting for all of these reasons, and particularly for the specific contrast between his enormous cultural power and the content of his commentary, which the show, with its liberal sensibility, found both appalling and farcically absurd. The jokes about Limbaugh were rarely subtle. The show was not particularly interested in nuance when it came to him, not in finding the complexity in the portrait, not in acknowledging whatever genuine talent had made him so effective for so long. The jokes were pointed in the specific direction of his politics and what those politics meant for the communities the show cared about. What is interesting about the Limbaugh material in retrospect is the way it documents the specific flavor of political combat that defined the Bush era in American life. The shouting, the demonization, the complete absence of any common ground or shared reality between the opposing sides. Family Guy was very much a participant in this cultural war, firmly on one side, throwing jokes across the trench at the enemy position. The Limbaugh jokes were part of this. They were weapons in a comedic arsenal, deployed in service of a political position that the show never pretended was neutral. Sean Hannity appeared in the show most notably in a later season episode that gave him something approaching a full portrait rather than just a punchline. The episode engaged with his specific combination of political commentary and genuine personal warmth toward people he considered his allies, a quality that his critics found particularly frustrating precisely because it made him harder to dismiss as simply malicious. Hannity was not Limbaugh. His approach was different, more collaborative, more interested in building coalitions, less devoted to pure confrontation for its own sake. The show found this worth exploring, even if the exploration was conducted with a fairly clear sense of where the show's sympathies lay. Bill O'Reilly, who occupied a primetime slot on Fox News for many years before his departure in 2017 following harassment allegations, appeared in Family Guy material that leaned heavily on the combative interview style he had perfected, the tendency to talk over his guests, the specific quality of theatrical outrage that had made his program appointment television for its core audience. The O'Reilly jokes were about performance, about the distinction between genuine conviction and a highly effective performance of conviction, about the way political media had developed a vocabulary of certainty and intensity that served an audience's emotional needs regardless of its relationship to factual accuracy. The show also spent time with commentators from the other side of the political spectrum, though with considerably more sympathy than it brought to the conservative media figures. Jon Stewart, who hosted The Daily Show during what many consider its peak years, appeared in material that was largely affectionate. Stewart's approach, using comedic analysis of news coverage to expose the absurdities and dishonesty of political media, had obvious affinities with what Family Guy was trying to do with its political material, and the show seemed to recognize a kindred spirit. Stephen Colbert, in his Daily Show correspondent and early Colbert Report persona, appeared in material that engaged with the sophisticated satirical project he was undertaking. Playing a character who was himself a parody of a specific kind of conservative pundit, performing the logic of that character so faithfully and so cleverly that the parody became its own kind of journalism. Family Guy found this interesting, probably because it was attempting something analogous in its own way, using fictional characters to say things about real situations that could not be said directly. Keith Olbermann, during his years at MSNBC, appeared in jokes that played with the operatic quality of his commentary, the specific grandiosity of his rhetorical style, the way he brought to left-wing political commentary the same thunderous intensity that the right-wing voices had pioneered. Olbermann seemed at times to have taken the lesson of Limbaugh's success and applied it to the opposite political position, that certainty and intensity and a willingness to demonize the opposition were effective regardless of which direction you pointed them. Family Guy found this worth noting, and the jokes about Olbermann, while sympathetic to his politics, were not entirely kind about the methods. Glenn Beck appeared in material that was less sympathetic. Beck's particular combination of emotional appeals, conspiracy theories, and theatrical weeping on air struck the show as less defensible than the more traditional forms of political commentary, even the ones it disagreed with. The jokes about Beck were among the sharper ones in this category, engaging directly with the question of where the line is between passionate advocacy and deliberate manipulation of an audience's fears. Chris Matthews, who hosted a program on MSNBC for many years with a style built around rapidly spoken opinionating and a particular quality of barely contained excitement about political events, appeared in jokes that captured the specific energy of his presence on air. The thrill Matthews took from political spectacle, the way he approached politics as a kind of sport with its own drama and narrative arcs, was material the show found both amusing and revealing about how political media had evolved. What all of these commentator portraits have in common, taken together, is that they are really portraits of a media landscape rather than of individual people. The show was interested in what it meant that American political discourse had come to be so thoroughly mediated by television personalities that the arguments about policy and values that should ideally happen in communities and legislative chambers were instead happening on screens, moderated by personalities whose primary skill was not governance or policy analysis, but the performance of conviction. This is not a small concern, and it predates Family Guy. The worry about what television does to political discourse goes back at least to the Nixon-Kennedy debates of 1960, the first presidential debates to be televised, in which Nixon's sweaty, uncomfortable appearance on screen cost him votes among television viewers, while radio listeners thought he won. Television changes politics in ways that may be deeper than we fully understand. Family Guy was made by people who grew up in this media landscape and who, in the process of satirizing it, were also inevitably reflecting it back. The political commentator jokes were not delivered from outside the media culture they were critiquing. They were made from within it, by a television show that was itself part of the landscape of opinion and spectacle and personality that it was examining. This is worth noting because it complicates the easy narrative of the show as pure critic. Family Guy was also a participant. Its treatment of political figures and commentators shaped public opinion in its own modest way. Its jokes became part of the cultural conversation. Its specific characterizations of specific people stuck in its audience's minds and shaped how they thought about those people. The show was not separate from the media ecosystem, it was critiquing. It was a piece of it. This does not invalidate the critique, but it should make us read the critique with a certain awareness of its context, the same awareness we bring to any piece of cultural work whose subject is the very culture it is embedded in. Section 10. The comedians Dane Cook, Carlos Mencia, and Seth's Own World. There is a specific kind of joke that comedians make about other comedians, and it is different from the jokes that anyone else makes about anyone else. When a comedian targets another comedian, the critique is not just personal, it is professional. It is a statement about what comedy is supposed to be, what it is supposed to do, and whether the person being targeted is doing it correctly or whether they are failing the art form in some way that deserves public acknowledgement. These jokes are simultaneously the most interesting kind of real-person comedy and the most revealing, because they tell you what the people making them actually believe about their craft. Family Guy, which is in many ways a show about how comedy works and what it can and cannot do, engaged with other comedians throughout its run in ways that were occasionally affectionate, frequently pointed, and sometimes more like industry commentary than entertainment. Dane Cook is perhaps the most direct example of this. Dane Cook, for those who need the context. He was, in the middle of the first decade of the 2000s, the most commercially successful stand-up comedian in America, by certain measures. His albums sold millions of copies. His arena shows sold out. He was enormously popular with young audiences in a way that made him one of the defining voices of a particular cultural moment. He was also widely disliked by other comedians and by comedy critics who argued that his success was disproportionate to his actual talent. The critique of Cook that circulated in comedy circles was specific, that his act was built more on energy and performance than on genuine comedic writing, that the jokes themselves did not hold up when separated from his delivery, that he was a phenomenon rather than an artist. This critique was applied to him with unusual vehemence, probably because his commercial success was so enormous and so visible that it seemed to demand explanation, and the explanation that his critics settled on was that the audience was being fooled. Family Guy engaged with this debate, finding in Cook a useful vehicle for a broader conversation about what makes comedy work. The jokes about him were not simply, Dane Cook is bad at comedy, which would have been too blunt to be interesting. They were more precisely aimed at the specific quality of his performance, the gap between the size of the response he generated and the sophistication of the mechanism generating it. This is actually an interesting comedic target, not failure but a particular kind of success that raises uncomfortable questions. The Cook material also touched on his personal controversies, including allegations that he had borrowed material from other comedians, specifically from Louis C.K. Material theft in stand-up is a serious charge in comedy circles, more serious than it might seem to people outside the world of stand-up, because a comedian's material is their most fundamental intellectual property, the thing they have spent years developing, and having it taken without credit is experienced as a profound violation. The allegations against Cook were disputed and never fully resolved, but they became part of his public biography, and Family Guy found ways to incorporate them. Carlos Mencia is the other comedian who received the most pointed treatment in the show. Mencia hosted a program called Mind of Mencia on Comedy Central that ran for several years in the mid-2000s and found a significant audience. He was also accused, publicly and in considerable detail, of stealing jokes from other comedians. The accusations were made most prominently by Joe Rogan, who confronted Mencia on stage at a comedy club in a recorded confrontation that was subsequently released and became widely viewed. Family Guy's treatment of Mencia engaged with these accusations directly, which was unusual. The show was willing to make explicit reference to the material theft allegations in a way that went beyond what most broadcast television would do when discussing an active public figure. The joke was not just that Mencia had allegedly stolen jokes. The joke was about what joke theft means, about authorship and originality in an art form that does not always have clean lines of intellectual property, about the specific vulnerability of comedic material to appropriation because of the way it circulates informally. There was also material in this section of the show's comedy that reflected Seth MacFarlane's own position in the comedy landscape and his relationship with his peers. MacFarlane had long had a complicated relationship with the broader comedy community. Family Guy was enormously popular, which generated a certain amount of hostility from people who found that popularity disproportionate to its merit. The South Park comparison, which we discussed earlier in the context of the cutaway gag critique, was part of this. MacFarlane's response to these criticisms, encoded in the show itself, is interesting. He was not above acknowledging the criticisms, incorporating them, using them as material. The meta-jokes about Family Guy's own quality, the fourth wall breaks where characters acknowledge that the show was perhaps not operating at the highest possible level, were both a way of diffusing criticism by getting ahead of it and a way of engaging with the fundamental questions about quality and popularity that the criticisms raised. The stand-up comedy world provided other material throughout the show's run. Jerry Seinfeld appeared in jokes that engaged with the Seinfeld phenomenon, the extraordinary success of a show that was famously and deliberately about nothing, and what that success said about what audiences actually wanted from comedy. The show about nothing description of Seinfeld, which the show itself had promoted, raised questions that Family Guy found interesting. If you make a show about nothing and it becomes one of the most watched shows in television history, what does that tell you about the relationship between content and form? Larry David, who co-created Seinfeld and then created Curb Your Enthusiasm, appeared in material that engaged with his specific comedic personality, the commitment to social discomfort, the willingness to follow the logic of social awkwardness to its most extreme conclusion, the refusal to let anyone off the hook, including himself. Larry David's comedy is fundamentally about the gap between social rules and human impulses, about the constant negotiation between what you actually want to do and what civilization requires, and Family Guy found genuine affinities with this project, even while finding the man himself a worthy subject for jokes. Robin Williams is a name that requires the same careful handling as Michael Jackson, because his death in 2014 changed the context in which everything about him is now understood. Before his death, Williams appeared in jokes that engaged with his legendary improvisational ability, his almost alarming facility with character and voice, the way he could inhabit a dozen different personas in a single minute of stage time. The comedy in Williams' jokes was usually about speed, about the cognitive vertigo of trying to keep up with someone whose mind moved faster than most people could follow. After his death, and particularly after more became known about the specific nature of the illness that had contributed to his state of mind in his final period, The Williams material became something that the show treated with considerably more care. The jokes about him stopped. What remained was reference, tribute, the acknowledgement of an extraordinary talent that had left a very large space behind it. Chris Rock appeared in material that engaged with his particularly analytical approach to stand-up comedy, the way he approached social observation with a rigor and precision that set him apart from more purely entertainment-focused comedians. Rock's best material is journalism in some sense, reporting on specific dimensions of American social reality with an accuracy and clarity that makes the recognition funny. Family Guy admired this project even when the specific content made the show's predominantly white writing room uncomfortable. Dave Chappelle appeared in material that wrestled with the complexity of his biography, particularly the famous decision he made in 2004 to walk away from a $50 million deal with Comedy Central and abandon the show that was making him the most prominent voice in American comedy. This decision, which Chappelle made because he was uncertain whether the comedy he was making was liberating or harmful, remains one of the most discussed acts of artistic self-examination in recent entertainment history. Family Guy found in it material that went to the heart of what the show was doing with its own most controversial material. The question of when comedy becomes something other than comedy, when the joke becomes part of the problem rather than part of the critique. The comedian section of Family Guy's real person comedy is ultimately about self-reflection, about a show examining its own art form through the lens of the practitioners who had shaped it, the ones it admired and the ones it found wanting, the ones who seemed to be doing what comedy was supposed to do, and the ones who seemed to be using the form for something that did not quite deserve the name. It is the most honest section of the show's real person catalog, and it is not always comfortable. Self-examination rarely is. Section 11. Bill Cosby, From America's Dad to America's Reckoning. Bill Cosby is one of the most complicated figures in the history of American entertainment, and Family Guy's treatment of him is one of the most complicated threads in its long history of real-person comedy. This requires care. Not the care of avoidance, not the care that leads you to simply skip the difficult thing because it is difficult, but the care of actually looking at it, of taking in its full complexity, of acknowledging what it contains. Bill Cosby was, for a long stretch of the 20th century, one of the most beloved figures in American public life. His stand-up comedy in the 1960s was groundbreaking, clean, observational, accessible, warmly funny in a way that appealed to audiences who would not have gone near the edgier comedy of the era. His children's album material was similarly beloved. His television work, including I Spy in the 1960s and then The Cosby Show, beginning in 1984, made him a genuinely historic figure. The Cosby Show was the most-watched program in America for 5 consecutive years. It presented an affluent, professional, loving Black American family in a way that television had essentially never done before, and its cultural impact was enormous. Cosby was referred to, without irony and with genuine warmth, as America's dad. He was also, according to the testimony of more than 60 women, and eventually to the verdict of a criminal court, a serial sexual predator who used his fame and access to drugs to assault women over a period of decades. The allegations were not new in 2014, when comedian Hannibal Buress named them in a stand-up routine that went viral and triggered a wave of new accusations and renewed attention to the ones that had been made previously. They had been circulating for years, in whisper networks, in court documents, in an out-of-court settlement from 2006 that had been kept confidential. The open secret existed in roughly the same form as the open secrets about Spacey and Weinstein, known to many people in certain circles. Not yet part of the mainstream public conversation. Family Guy's engagement with Cosby predates the public explosion of the story in 2014. There were jokes in earlier seasons that operated in the register of the obvious open secret, jokes that referenced Cosby's carefully constructed, family-friendly public image alongside jokes that pointed, with varying degrees of directness, at what lay beneath it. These jokes are uncomfortable to revisit, not because they were cruel to Cosby, but because they were part of the same cultural mechanism of acknowledged, but unaddressed, that kept the story from breaking into the mainstream for as long as it did. After the story broke, after the criminal charges, after the conviction and imprisonment, and then the overturning of the conviction on procedural grounds, the show's earlier material became something different from what it had been. It became a piece of evidence, in the loosest sense, evidence that the information was available, that the people making the show had encountered it, that the cultural knowledge existed in a form that was publicly accessible, even if it was not yet being publicly addressed. The question this raises is one that the entertainment industry has been wrestling with since 2017. What do you do with art made by or associated with people who turned out to be doing terrible things? What do you do with an episode of The Cosby Show? What do you do with a stand-up special that seemed innocent when it was recorded, and that now, in retrospect, feels like it was made by a stranger? What do you do with the jokes that other shows made about Cosby's public persona, when that public persona was a deliberately constructed fiction? There is no consensus answer to these questions. Different people and institutions have taken different positions. Some argue that the art should be separated entirely from the artist, that the work stands alone and can be evaluated on its own terms regardless of what is known about the person who made it. Others argue that the art cannot be separated from the knowledge of what it was built on, that watching a Cosby performance now is an act of complicity in the mythology that protected him. Family Guy did not resolve this debate. It is not the kind of show that resolves debates, but its treatment of Cosby across multiple seasons, the arc from earlier jokes to the post-2014 silence, is itself a record of how the culture moved through this particular reckoning, and that record is worth preserving even when it is uncomfortable. There is also something important to acknowledge about the specific nature of the Cosby tragedy in the context of American racial history. Cosby's legacy was not simply personal. The Cosby Show had done something real and important in American culture. It had presented a vision of Black American life that was aspirational and warm and funny and entirely free of the stereotypes that had dominated Black representation in American media for decades. It had made an argument, in the most popular television show in the country, that Black families were exactly like other families, complicated, loving, smart, funny, fully human. That argument needed to be made. It landed. It changed something. The revelations about Cosby did not make that argument false. But they entangled it with something terrible, and the people whose experience of seeing themselves represented in that show was meaningful found themselves in an impossible position, asked to hold the genuine good and the genuine evil in the same space. Family Guy, to its credit, did not try to simplify this. The show's later references to Cosby acknowledge the complexity without resolving it, which is the honest position, even if it is an uncomfortable one to occupy. There is also a generation-specific dimension to the Cosby material that is worth noting. Family Guy's writers were roughly of an age to have grown up watching The Cosby Show, to have had it as a piece of their cultural formation, to feel its revelation as a personal betrayal in addition to a public one. This personal dimension is not absent from the show's treatment of the subject. The anger in the later Cosby jokes, such as they were, had an edge that the jokes about most other figures did not quite have, an edge that came from something more personal than political disagreement. This is one of the more honest things about Family Guy's engagement with Cosby. The acknowledgement that betrayal feels different from ordinary disappointment, that having loved something makes its corruption feel different from never having loved it in the first place. The Cosby section of the show's Real Person catalog is one of the darkest threads in a catalog that has many dark threads. It is also one of the most important, because it documents the specific mechanism by which an open secret remains secret. The jokes that acknowledge without accusing, the references that point without naming, the comedy that uses humor as a pressure valve that releases just enough of the tension to prevent the explosion that would actually change things. Comedy can be a way of telling the truth. It can also be a way of telling just enough of the truth to feel like something is being done while ensuring that nothing actually is. Family Guy was both of these things, at different moments and sometimes at the same moment. And the Cosby material is where that tension is most visible and most uncomfortable. Section 12. International Figures, Royals, and World Leaders. There is a particular pleasure in watching an American comedy show attempt to make jokes about figures from outside America because the jokes reveal, with unusual clarity, exactly which parts of the outside world have penetrated the American cultural consciousness and which parts have remained comfortably beyond it. Family Guy's international material is a map of American cultural awareness, charted in jokes rather than in geography. The United Kingdom gets by far the most sustained treatment of any foreign country in the show's catalog of real-person comedy. This makes intuitive sense. The cultural connection between the United States and Britain is deeper and more thoroughly maintained than any other transatlantic relationship, nourished by shared language, shared entertainment industry relationships, shared history both glorious and terrible, and a specific tradition of cultural exchange that has been operating at high intensity since the Beatles first appeared on American television in 1964. The British royal family has been a recurring source of material for the show, particularly Queen Elizabeth II, who during her lifetime occupied a unique position in global celebrity culture as a figure of absolute public familiarity, who simultaneously revealed almost nothing of her inner life. The Queen jokes in Family Guy tended to operate in this space of opacity, finding comedy in the profound gap between her ubiquitous public image and the complete absence of any genuine personal revelation that image contained. She was everywhere and revealed nothing, and this combination is inherently funny in the specific way that total opacity is funny, because it invites speculation and projection, and the comic possibilities of those are almost infinite. Prince Charles, who became King Charles III in 2022, appeared in material that engaged with the long and complicated trajectory of his public life. The decades of waiting to ascend to a position he was born for, the relationship with Princess Diana and its extraordinary public dimensions, the marriage to Camilla and the long process of public reassessment that surrounded it. The Charles jokes were among the show's more genuinely complex portraits of a royal figure, probably because his story is genuinely complex in ways that do not simplify easily. Princess Diana, who died in 1997 and whose death predated the show's premiere, appears primarily in retrospective references that engage with the specific mythology that accumulated around her after her death. The Diana mythology is one of the most powerful celebrity mythologies of the late 20th century, partly because of the circumstances of her death and partly because of the extraordinary speed with which she became a symbol for multiple and sometimes contradictory things. Innocence betrayed, feminine vulnerability, resistance to an oppressive institution, the price of celebrity, the cruelty of the press. Family Guy approached this mythology with a mixture of acknowledgement and gentle puncturing, the way you approach any mythology that has become so enormous that it needs to be brought back to a human scale. Tony Blair received treatment that reflected his extraordinary political journey. From the New Labour modernizer who reinvigorated the British left in the late 1990s, to the figure who tied himself to the Iraq War with consequences that defined his legacy in ways he clearly had not anticipated. Blair's combination of genuine political talent, evident personal warmth, and the specific catastrophe of the Iraq decision made him a rich subject. The jokes about Blair often operated in the space between his charm and his choices, finding in that gap material that was both funny and genuinely critical. Margaret Thatcher, who had been out of power for years by the time Family Guy began, but whose influence on British society remained deeply contested, appeared in retrospective material that engaged with the specific political mythology that had formed around her, in both positive and negative registers. She was, depending on who you asked, either the savior of the British economy or the destroyer of British communities. And both assessments were made with an intensity that testified to the reality of her impact. Vladimir Putin appeared in the show with increasing frequency as his public profile became more prominent internationally. The jokes about Putin were among the show's sharper international material, engaging with his carefully constructed public persona, the staged photographs of shirtless outdoor activities, the specific brand of authoritarian performance that he had developed into something almost like a genre. The Putin jokes understood that the persona was a performance, that the hypermasculine outdoor adventures were a designed communication strategy, and found the comedy in the gap between the strategy's sophistication and its somewhat crude content. Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, appeared in material that operated in the specific comedic territory of totalitarian absurdity, the comedy of a system so completely removed from any ordinary human reality that describing it accurately already sounds like comedy. The Kim Jong-un jokes were generally among the show's more cautious international material, probably because the comedy of absolute power is difficult to separate from the reality of what absolute power does to people who have no choice but to live under it. The jokes that land best in this category are the ones that keep that reality somewhere in the frame, that do not allow the comedy to entirely neutralize the horror. Saddam Hussein, who was alive and in power when the show began and was executed in 2006, following the American invasion of Iraq and his subsequent capture and trial, appeared in material that was considerably less cautious. Hussein jokes in Family Guy tended towards straightforward vilification, probably because the case against him was as clear as any historical case could be, and the comedy did not need to hold multiple perspectives in tension. There was something almost cathartic about Hussein jokes, a directness that most of the show's real-person material avoided, but that felt appropriate here. Osama bin Laden appeared in material that was primarily from the years immediately following September 11th, when jokes about him served a specific cultural function. Humor about terrorism and its perpetrators in the years after 2001 was a complicated and contested space in American culture, and the bin Laden material in Family Guy was part of that complicated space. Some of the jokes worked, some did not. All of them were doing something specific about the cultural moment in which they were made. The Pope, as a recurring institutional figure rather than any specific individual, appeared throughout the show's run in material that engaged with the Catholic Church's public image, and the gap between that image and the abuse scandal that had been emerging in public consciousness since at least the early 2000s. The show was willing to be direct about this in a way that caused considerable discomfort for some viewers and considerable relief for others. The Vatican jokes were among the show's most consistently pointed religious material, reflecting the specific relationship between a show with liberal sensibilities and an institution that embodied traditional authority in a particularly visible way. Nelson Mandela appeared in material that was uniformly respectful, reflecting a quality of genuine moral authority that the show found it impossible to satirize. Mandela had earned, through the specific circumstances of his life and the specific choices he made in conditions of extraordinary pressure, a kind of regard that even the most irreverent comedy hesitates to puncture. The jokes that acknowledged him were celebrations, not satire. Fidel Castro, who died in 2016, appeared in material that was more equivocal than the material about clearly malevolent figures, but less unambiguously positive than the Mandela material. Castro's legacy, like the man himself, was complicated, genuinely beloved by some, genuinely reviled by others, the embodiment of a particular mid-20th century revolutionary project that had both genuine achievements and genuine atrocities to its credit. The show captured some of this complexity, if not all of it. The international section of Family Guy's real-person comedy is ultimately a record of what the show knew and cared about beyond America's borders, which is itself a kind of portrait. The extensive coverage of Britain relative to most other countries reflects the cultural relationship. The treatment of Cold War adversaries and their successors reflects specific fears and anxieties of specific moments. The relative sparseness of material about countries and regions that do not occupy a large place in American cultural consciousness is itself a form of information. The world is large, and the show knew a specific, shaped piece of it that is honest in its way. Section 13. The celebrity cameos when real voices walked into the animation. There is a specific category of real-person engagement in Family Guy that stands somewhat apart from the jokes and references and satirical portraits we have been examining. This is the voice cameo, the episode where a real person lent their actual voice to an animated version of themselves, walked into the Griffin family's world, and became, for the length of an episode or a scene or sometimes just a single memorable exchange, a character in the show's fiction. These cameos are worth examining on their own terms because they introduce a variable that the other categories of real-person comedy do not have: the consent and participation of the subject. When Family Guy made jokes about James Woods or Bill Cosby or George W. Bush without their involvement, the comedy was external to them, something being done to them rather than with them. But when a real person came into the recording studio and voiced a version of themselves for the show, they were collaborating in the construction of their own fictional portrait, and that changes the relationship between the joke and the subject. Some of these cameos were straightforward. Celebrities who appeared as themselves for brief moments, playing up their public personas in ways that were mostly good-natured, trading on whatever specific quality of their celebrity was useful to the episode. These cameos were a form of cultural currency, a signal to the audience that the show had access to the real world in a way that pure animation could not claim, that the celebrities were playing along, that the joke was shared rather than imposed. Rush Limbaugh appeared in an episode in a voice cameo that was, given the show's political orientation, a somewhat surprising collaboration. The fact that Limbaugh agreed to participate suggested a quality of self-awareness about his public persona that his critics sometimes denied him, a willingness to be in on the joke about himself that complicated the simpler portrait the show had otherwise constructed. Whether this was genuine self-awareness, or a calculated media move, or both, was left usefully ambiguous. Adam West, before his death in 2017, was both a recurring voice performer and the subject of extensive and affectionate comedy. His connection to Family Guy went beyond occasional cameo. He voiced the mayor of the fictional Rhode Island town for multiple seasons, a role that gave him sustained creative involvement with the show. The mayor character was written specifically for West, drawing on and playing with the specific quality of dignified eccentricity that had defined his public persona since the Batman television series of the 1960s. The Batman reference is impossible to avoid in discussing West, and the show did not avoid it. The joke of Adam West in Family Guy was always partly about Batman, about the specific vintage of superhero entertainment he represented, about the way the 1960s television series had defined his public identity so thoroughly that everything that came after existed in its shadow. West seemed entirely at peace with this, engaging with the Batman legacy and his Family Guy work with a mixture of fond nostalgia and gentle comedy that suggested a man who had found a genuinely good way to carry a genuinely heavy cultural burden. When Adam West died in June 2017, the show's response was genuinely affecting. The season 16 premiere was dedicated to his memory in ways that went beyond the formal dedication card. The episode engaged with the loss of his character in a way that acknowledged the real grief that the cast and crew felt, that treated the death of a character in a comedy show as something that could carry real emotional weight when the character was voiced by a real person who had himself died. The comedy and the grief were allowed to coexist without one canceling out the other, and the result was one of the show's most genuinely moving moments. Carrie Fisher appeared in the show in a role that also eventually became a memorial. Fisher, the daughter of Debbie Reynolds and Eddie Fisher and the cultural icon best known for her role as Princess Leia in the Star Wars franchise, voiced a character in Family Guy who reflected certain dimensions of her own biography: the Hollywood dynasty, the complicated relationship with fame, the mental health struggles she had been unusually open about, the sharp wit that made her one of the most interesting public voices of her generation. When Fisher died in December 2016, the show's treatment of her character became a kind of tribute, and the voice recordings she had made were preserved and cherished in a way that allowed something of her to continue in the fiction even after her death in reality. The Star Wars connection brings us to what is probably the most elaborate celebrity cameo enterprise in Family Guy's history: the extended Star Wars parody trilogy, beginning with Blue Harvest in 2007, continuing with Something Dark Side in 2009, and concluding with It's a Trap in 2010. These were full-length, episode-length parodies of the original Star Wars trilogy, with the Griffin family and their associates voicing the major characters. The enterprise involved engaging with Lucasfilm and with the Star Wars cast in ways that made the series both more elaborate and more complex than a simple parody. The Star Wars parodies gave the show an opportunity to engage with specific members of the original trilogy cast in specific ways. Mark Hamill, Carrie Fisher, and Harrison Ford were all referenced with different flavors of comedy that reflected their individual post-Star Wars trajectories. Hamill had remained closely associated with the franchise, and with nerd culture more broadly, becoming a beloved figure in the convention circuit and a committed voice actor in his own right. The jokes about Hamill were affectionate, acknowledging both his place in cultural history and his particular quality of enthusiastic engagement with his fans. Harrison Ford presented a more complicated comedic portrait, having spent much of his post-Star Wars career apparently wishing that Star Wars would leave him alone, maintaining a complicated relationship with the franchise that made his eventual return to it in later years all the more remarkable. The Ford jokes captured this quality of reluctant iconic status, of being permanently associated with something you may have complicated feelings about. The celebrity cameo section of the show's history also includes a remarkable number of musicians who appeared as themselves. Cyndi Lauper, Bryan Adams, and various other performers from specific eras of popular music appeared in episodes that engaged with their cultural significance in ways that ranged from fond tribute to gentle parody. The musicians who appeared as themselves tended to receive more consistently affectionate treatment than the politicians, probably because the show's relationship with music was more clearly one of genuine love rather than critical engagement. Stuart Lee, a British comedian who represents one of the more obscure international cameo connections, appeared in material that was primarily aimed at British audiences who would recognize him, and whose inclusion was one of the show's periodic nods to its international fan base. The cameo enterprise as a whole reveals something important about how the show understood celebrity. The people who agreed to appear as themselves in Family Guy were engaging in a specific kind of collaboration. They were trading their identity for an animated adventure, lending their voice and their permission, and implicitly their endorsement to a creative work that would do something with those materials that they could not entirely control. Some of them used this transaction wisely, delivering something that felt genuinely surprising or moving or funny in a way that their regular public work did not. Others simply showed up and said the lines, and the result was pleasant but not particularly illuminating. The best cameos were the ones where the real person brought something of themselves that the show's writers had not quite anticipated, where the gap between the written character and the actual person speaking the lines created a productive friction that made the scene more than either element alone would have been. These moments, when they occurred, were among the show's most interesting. Brief glimpses of the strange, charged space between fiction and reality, where the most interesting things in art sometimes live. Section 14. The Long Goodnight Legacy, Reflection, and What It All Meant. We have traveled a long way through the Griffin family's neighborhood tonight. We have walked through all the famous faces that populated their world over more than 2 decades, the presidents and pop stars and athletes and actors and commentators and comedians and royals and world leaders who passed through the fiction and left their fingerprints on it. We have paused at the darker moments, the ones where the comedy pointed at something real and uncomfortable and refused to look away. We have spent time with the lighter ones, the pure affection jokes, the warm tributes disguised as teasing. We have traced the arc of the show's relationship with celebrity from the early seasons when it was still finding its voice, all the way through to the later years when it had said so much about so many people that the archive of references had become its own kind of monument. Now we are at the end, or close to it. And endings, in a long, slow exploration like this one, deserve their own careful attention. What does it mean that Family Guy made these jokes? What does the full catalog of its real-person comedy actually tell us when you step back far enough to see the whole shape of it? The first thing it tells us is something about the specific nature of American celebrity culture and how it functions as a shared language. Family Guy could make a joke about Tom Brady, or Rush Limbaugh, or Mel Gibson, or Michael Jackson, and expect that a significant portion of its audience would bring to that name a whole universe of associated meaning, emotion, and judgment. The joke did not need to explain who these people were. It could assume a common cultural vocabulary, a shared archive of images and incidents and controversies and achievements and failures that the audience had accumulated through years of living in the same media landscape. This shared vocabulary is not trivial. It is one of the things that holds a culture together, the common references that allow people from different backgrounds and different regions and different circumstances to recognize each other as part of the same story. The celebrity references in Family Guy were a form of this cultural glue, a way of saying, we all know these names and we all have feelings about them, and we can make comedy from those feelings because they are shared. But the shared vocabulary is also, sometimes, a trap. When a culture shares a vocabulary, it also shares the assumptions embedded in that vocabulary, including the assumptions about who matters and who does not, whose stories are worth telling and whose are not, which kinds of fame are worthy of celebration and which are worthy of mockery. Family Guy absorbed and reflected these assumptions, sometimes critically and sometimes not, and the result is a portrait of a culture's biases as much as a portrait of the celebrities themselves. The second thing the full catalog tells us is something about the specific historical moment that produced it. Family Guy has been on the air from the final years of the Clinton administration, through the Bush years, through the Obama years, through the Trump years, through the Biden years, and into the present. That is a remarkable span of American history to have documented in comedy form, and the celebrity jokes are part of that documentation. The jokes about Bush tell you what it felt like to be a politically progressive person in America in the early 2000s. The jokes about Obama tell you about the specific mixture of hope and disappointment that characterized his era. The jokes about Trump tell you about the specific terror and bewilderment that defined his. All of these are historical documents, in the loose sense that any cultural artifact is a historical document, preserving the textures of the moment that produced them. The third thing, and perhaps the most important, is something about the nature of the comedy itself. Family Guy is a show that made its reputation on irreverence, on the willingness to say things that other shows would not say, to go places other shows would not go, to make jokes that made some people uncomfortable while making others feel seen and understood. This is a genuine service that irreverent comedy can provide. The jokes that disturb the peace are sometimes the ones that disturb something that deserve to be disturbed. But irreverence without direction is just noise. The best real-person comedy in Family Guy's catalog was the irreverence that was pointed at something specific, that was saying something particular about the person in the frame, or the culture they inhabited, or the way celebrity functions in American life. The jokes about OJ and the culture of denial. The jokes about the open secrets that the industry protected until it could not protect them anymore. The jokes about political media and the way it shaped public opinion by performing rather than informing. These were the moments when the show was doing something that deserved the attention it got. The worst real-person comedy in the catalog was the irreverence that was simply pointed at convenient targets, that used recognizable names for cheap recognition without saying anything worth saying, that treated celebrities as props rather than as people, and in doing so sometimes participated in harms it could not have anticipated or simply chose not to think too hard about. Both kinds were present throughout the show's run. Both kinds were part of the same creative enterprise. The catalog, taken in total, is neither a pure celebration nor a pure indictment. It is what everything long and complicated is: a mixture, an argument with itself, evidence of a group of talented, flawed, funny, sometimes thoughtful and sometimes careless people trying to make sense of the world they were living in through the specific medium of comedy. Seth MacFarlane created this world in 1999 at 25 years old, and 25 years later it was still running, still making jokes about real people, still adding to the archive. The show that began with the ambition and energy of a young creator determined to do something new had become something else over time. An institution, a brand, a piece of cultural furniture that people arrange their habits around without always consciously choosing to. The late season's celebrity jokes are different from the early season's celebrity jokes, not primarily because the celebrities changed, though some did, but because the relationship between the show and its own enterprise changed. The early jokes came from hunger. The later jokes came from habit. Both kinds have value. The hunger produces something raw and surprising. The habit produces something settled and reliable. Different viewers want different things, and the show has provided both. There is also something worth acknowledging about the specific experience of watching all of this in the dark, at the end of a long day, letting the voices wash over you while your mind loosens its grip on the specific concerns of your specific life and begins to drift toward the softer, more diffuse territory of sleep. Family Guy, for all its irreverence and edge, has always had a quality that makes it suitable for this purpose. The rhythm of its comedy, the joke followed by the response followed by the next joke, is hypnotic in its way. The familiar voices, Peter's particular sound, Brian's dry precision, Stewie's operatic self-importance, these are sounds that the longtime viewer has absorbed so thoroughly that they have become part of the internal landscape, recognizable and comfortable even when the content is surprising. This is not nothing. There is real value in the familiar. There is real comfort in the company of voices you have known for a long time, voices that have been with you through different phases of your life, voices that represent a kind of continuity even as everything else changes. The real people who passed through Family Guy's animation gave the show a connection to the actual world that pure fiction cannot achieve. They were the anchors that kept the Griffin family's ridiculous adventures tethered to reality. The reminder that the show was being made by people who lived in the same world as its audience, who watched the same news and felt the same confusion, and used comedy the same way the audience did, as a way of processing things that were otherwise difficult to hold. All of which is to say, the jokes about real people in Family Guy were never just jokes. They were the shape of a culture's relationship with celebrity. They were the evidence of what people knew and what they chose to do with that knowledge. They were the record of what it felt like to be alive in a particular time and place, watching particular people do particular things and laughing, sometimes uncomfortably, sometimes gratefully, sometimes with the specific relief of someone who recognizes that the thing they have been carrying alone is actually a shared burden. That is what comedy can do, at its best. And that is what this show has been doing, imperfectly and persistently, for 25 years. Let your eyes close now, if they have not already. Let the weight of the day settle. The presidents and pop stars and athletes and actors and all the rest of them will be waiting if you want to find them again. They are preserved in the archive. All those jokes, all those references, all those surprising moments of accidental honesty dressed up as punchlines. They will keep. For now, sleep. Section 15. The television world late-night hosts, talk show icons, and the celebrities who made their living talking about other celebrities. There is a specific ecosystem within the broader celebrity world that Family Guy found particularly rich for comedy, and it is the ecosystem of people whose entire career consists of talking about other famous people. The late-night hosts, the talk show personalities, the morning show anchors, the people who sit behind desks and conduct interviews and comment on current events, and do so for decades in front of audiences of millions, accumulating cultural power and public familiarity that eventually makes them celebrities in their own right, celebrities whose subject matter is celebrity itself. Johnny Carson set the template. Carson hosted The Tonight Show from 1962 to 1992, 30 years of late-night television that defined what American television personality could be. He was urbane, controlled, funny in a way that was never quite threatening, comfortable with everyone, and intimate with no one. He revealed very little of himself in 30 years of nightly television, which is a remarkable achievement, and which gave his persona a quality of projection screen that made him simultaneously universally beloved and somehow unknowable. Family Guy referenced Carson with the respect that a later generation of comedy always reserves for the defining figure of the preceding one, acknowledging the template while existing in the world after the template had been revised. Jay Leno, who succeeded Carson and hosted Tonight for 22 years before a complicated corporate struggle and handover to Conan O'Brien, appeared in Family Guy material that engaged with the specific controversy of his public biography. Leno is a complicated figure in television history, enormously successful in conventional terms, enormously disliked by portions of the comedy community, his Tonight Show tenure producing numbers that made him the most watched late-night host of his era, while also generating persistent criticism that he had achieved this success by sanding off whatever edges made late-night comedy interesting. The Conan O'Brien conflict, in which NBC promised The Tonight Show to O'Brien and then reversed course when Leno's primetime experiment failed, became one of the most publicly discussed corporate decisions in television history and gave Family Guy considerable material about loyalty, betrayal, corporate calculation, and the specific indignities that television networks visit upon the people who make their schedules. David Letterman, the other dominant late-night figure of the post-Carson era, appeared in material that was considerably more affectionate. Letterman's comedy, with its combination of intellectual aggression, barely concealed contempt for the machinery of celebrity, and occasional moments of genuine vulnerability, had obvious affinities with the kind of comedy Family Guy was trying to make. The joke Letterman was always telling, underneath all the other jokes, was about the absurdity of the enterprise itself. The absurdity of sitting behind a desk every night and talking to famous people while pretending this was a normal or necessary thing to do. Family Guy appreciated this meta-quality. Conan O'Brien himself appeared in material that was almost entirely affectionate, probably because his specific public persona, lanky, self-deprecating, enthusiastically absurdist, aligned closely with Family Guy's own comedic sensibility. The O'Brien jokes engaged with his Harvard background, his specific quality of intellectual energy deployed in the service of very silly things, his obvious genuine love of comedy, and the specific arc of his career, which included extraordinary success, a very public humiliation, and a reinvention that suggested genuine creative courage. Craig Ferguson, the Scottish comedian who hosted The Late Late Show for a decade before departing in 2014, received treatment that was warm and engaged in a way that reflected his particular quality of live-wire unpredictability. Ferguson was the late-night host who seemed most likely to go genuinely off-script on any given night, whose interview style was less structured and more exploratory than his peers, who seemed to be discovering what he thought in the same moment the audience was discovering it with him. Family Guy found this appealing. Ellen DeGeneres, from the groundbreaking coming-out episode of her sitcom in 1997 through the long run of her talk show, and eventually through the controversy of her later years. The Ellen arc is one of the more complete trajectories in the show's real-person catalog. From figure of genuine cultural significance, whose coming out had real consequences for the visibility of gay people in American mainstream entertainment, through beloved daily talk show presence, to the complicated reassessment of her public persona that followed reports about the working environment on her show. The show captured different moments in this arc, though not necessarily with consistent engagement with its full complexity. Oprah Winfrey occupied a unique position in Family Guy's real-person catalog because she is in some ways uniquely difficult to satirize. Oprah's public persona is constructed with such skill. Her intelligence and emotional intelligence are both so evident. Her cultural influence is so genuinely enormous that finding a comedic angle on her requires either unusual creativity or a willingness to go somewhere that the show generally avoided. Family Guy tended toward the approach of engaging with the scale of her influence, finding comedy in the simply extraordinary numbers involved in her reach, the book club that could make bestsellers overnight, the giveaway episodes that became pop culture events, the specific quality of emotional directness she brought to topics that American television usually handled more obliquely. The daytime television world also gave the show material in the form of the iconic talk shows that shaped American conversation for decades. The View, with its ensemble of female hosts discussing current events and popular culture, appeared in jokes that engaged with the specific social dynamics of the show's format and with the personalities who had occupied its chairs over the years. The particular combustibility of The View's combination of personalities, the way genuine disagreement could surface beneath the format's civility, was rich material. Jerry Springer gave the show material that was almost too easy, but that the show found ways to make interesting anyway. The Springer Show, which reached its peak in the late 1990s, was a remarkable document of American social dysfunction presented as entertainment, and the questions it raised about exploitation and voyeurism and class and what it meant to construct entertainment from other people's worst moments were ones that Family Guy was genuinely interested in, even when the jokes themselves were surface level. Dr. Phil, the television psychologist whose program became enormously successful and who eventually became a celebrity in his own right, largely separate from any specific psychological credentials, appeared in material that engaged with the specific genre he represented, the therapeutic confrontation as television entertainment. The questions this genre raises about consent and exploitation and what it means to process genuine trauma in front of a live studio audience were ones the show circled without always landing on cleanly. The news anchor world provided additional material throughout the show's run. Dan Rather, who had been one of the dominant figures in American broadcast journalism for decades before a controversy about documents related to George W. Bush's military service ended his career at CBS, appeared in material that engaged with the specific way his fall from grace illustrated something about the changing landscape of journalism and the new vulnerabilities of traditional media institutions. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America for a generation, appeared in retrospective material that engaged with what it meant to have had that title, what the culture was expressing when it gave one television anchor that much authority. Anderson Cooper, whose career at CNN had made him one of the defining faces of a particular kind of field journalism, appeared in material that was largely respectful of his genuine courage in covering dangerous situations while finding some gentle comedy in the specific combination of personal beauty and professional gravitas that defined his public image. All of these people, all of these voices, were part of the same landscape that Family Guy itself inhabited. The landscape of American television, of the medium that shaped culture and was shaped by it, of the specific world that a show about a fictional Rhode Island family was competing in and commenting on and ultimately adding to. The late-night and talk show world was, in some ways, the most self-referential part of the show's real-person catalog, The part where Family Guy was making jokes about the industry it existed in, about the people who represented different approaches to the project of making entertainment for American television audiences, these jokes were never entirely innocent of self-interest. They were a show making arguments about television, arguments that could not help but also be arguments about itself. This is perhaps the most honest thing about them. Section 16. The actors who became characters. From Robin Williams to Adam Sandler and everyone in between. There is a particular category of film actor who accumulates, over the course of a career, a public persona so specific and so thoroughly constructed that it becomes, in the cultural imagination, almost a separate entity from the person who built it. The persona and the person share a name and a face and a biography, but they are not quite the same thing. The persona is more consistent than any real person can be, more reliably committed to its defining characteristics, more perfectly itself every time you encounter it. The person is messier, more contradictory, more subject to the ordinary chaos of being alive. Family Guy was endlessly fascinated by this gap between the persona and the person, and nowhere was this fascination more productively deployed than in its treatment of the specific cohort of film comedians who defined popular entertainment in the 1990s and 2000s. Adam Sandler is the clearest example of what can happen when a performer's persona becomes so precisely defined that it calcifies into something that is simultaneously lovable and limiting. Sandler built an enormous popular following on the basis of a specific kind of comedy, broad, physical, often deliberately juvenile, committed to a particular rhythm of humor that its fans found endlessly satisfying and its critics found endlessly frustrating. His films made extraordinary amounts of money. His detractors, who were numerous and vocal in certain critical quarters, argued that the money proved something disappointing about popular taste rather than something admirable about his talent. Family Guy engaged with Sandler's specific place in the cultural conversation, finding in him a useful vehicle for examining a question that the show was itself frequently confronted with. The question of whether commercial success is evidence of merit, whether the popularity of something is itself a form of argument for its quality, or whether the two things can be entirely separated. These are not simple questions, and the show did not always handle them simply, but the Sandler material was one place where the questions surfaced with particular clarity. Jim Carrey, whose career peaked in the 1990s with a series of enormous commercial successes that showcased a physical comedy gift that seemed genuinely original, appeared in material that engaged with the specific quality of his public persona, which was equally extreme in its professional and personal dimensions. Carrey's combination of extraordinary physical expressiveness and an off-screen persona that seemed to be conducting a sustained philosophical investigation of the nature of identity and reality gave the show considerable material. The comedy in Carrey jokes was often about the gap between the rubber-faced comic genius and the person who gave interviews that sounded like they were working through something fairly intense. Will Ferrell, who replaced Carrey as the dominant American film comedian for a stretch of the 2000s, appeared in material that engaged with the specific brand of comedy he had developed, the slow-burning, commitment-to-absurdity approach, where the joke was how completely the performer inhabited an absurd premise, the insistence on playing ridiculous characters with total sincerity. The jokes about Ferrell were largely affectionate, reflecting the show's apparent fondness for comedians who brought genuine craft to apparently silly work. Steve Martin, the elder statesman of this cohort, appeared in retrospective material that acknowledged his place in the history of American comedy with something close to reverence. Martin's trajectory, from wild and crazy guy of the late 1970s through the dramatic actor of the 1990s through the bluegrass musician and novelist and playwright of the 2000s, is one of the more remarkable careers in American entertainment. And Family Guy found in it evidence of something interesting about the relationship between popular success and artistic ambition, about the possibility of doing both without sacrificing either. Bill Murray occupies a unique position in this category because his public persona, off-screen as much as on-screen, has become its own kind of art. The stories about Murray showing up unexpectedly at ordinary events, inserting himself into strangers' photographs, performing random acts of surprising generosity or equally surprising rudeness, have accumulated into a mythology that now rivals his actual filmography in cultural significance. The Murray mythology is itself a kind of comedy, a long-form improvisational piece that he has been performing for decades, and Family Guy found this endlessly interesting. The jokes about Murray were as much about the mythology as about any specific film or role. Chevy Chase appeared in material that engaged with the complicated gap between the talent that had made him a founding cast member of Saturday Night Live and the reputation he had accumulated as a difficult person to work with, a reputation so persistent and so widely confirmed that it had become part of his public biography in a way that was difficult to separate from his artistic achievements. The Chase material was among the sharper portraits in this category, finding in his specific situation a kind of cautionary tale about the relationship between talent and character. John Candy, though dead since 1994, appeared in retrospective material that was purely affectionate, the kind of tribute you give to someone whose work you loved and who left too early. Candy represented a specific quality of warmth and comedy that Family Guy seemed to genuinely miss, a quality that many of the louder, more aggressive comedic voices of the era he existed in did not share. The action hero category produced its own strand of real-person comedy. Beyond Schwarzenegger and Stallone, who we have touched on already, the show found rich material in figures like Bruce Willis, whose specific combination of sardonic cool and action competence had defined a particular 1980s and 1990s vision of American masculinity. The Die Hard films created a mythology around Willis that was so thoroughly internalized that the jokes about him were always partly about the mythology rather than the man. Nicolas Cage is perhaps the most interesting figure in the action-adjacent comedy territory. Cage's career arc, from serious dramatic actor to Academy Award winner for Leaving Las Vegas to star of increasingly eccentric action films to meme, is one of the more remarkable trajectories in recent entertainment history, and Family Guy found it irresistible. The Cage jokes were about the sheer breadth and strangeness of his filmography, the sense that he had made so many films in so many genres with such total commitment that the category of Nicolas Cage film had become its own genre, a thing you could identify by its specific texture of intense, slightly unhinged energy, regardless of what the plot was. Johnny Depp appeared in material that evolved substantially across the show's run, reflecting the evolution of his public profile from beloved quirky film star to figure of controversy to legally contested public figure. The Pirates of the Caribbean-era Depp, the peak of his commercial success, generated jokes that were largely fond. The later material was considerably more complicated, engaging with the allegations and counter-allegations that became major public news and that divided public opinion in ways that the show, characteristically, did not fully resolve. The film actor category also extended to the older generation of Hollywood that we touched on in Section 4, but there are additional figures worth noting here. Jack Nicholson had already been discussed. Dustin Hoffman appeared in material that engaged with his reputation for intense preparation and commitment to method acting, the approach to performance that prioritizes the actor's complete immersion in the role above all other considerations. The jokes about Hoffman were about the specific comedy of extreme commitment, of treating the preparation for art as an activity that could itself become extreme enough to be funny. Meryl Streep presented an interesting challenge for the show. She is so thoroughly respected, her technical excellence so universally acknowledged, that finding a comedic angle on her required the show to find something to push against. It settled on the specific combination of relentless critical acclaim and the peculiar self-consciousness about that acclaim. The way very serious art can sometimes tip over into a quality of self-regard that is its own kind of comedy. The Streep jokes were gentle but pointed in this direction. The film comedy of the decade after Family Guy's premiere ties many ways the show's own generation, and the relationships between Family Guy and the Judd Apatow comedy world, which included Seth Rogen and Paul Rudd and Jonah Hill and Jason Segel among others, were reflected in material that felt more like peer commentary than external satire. These were jokes made by people who knew the targets in the way that you know the people who inhabit the same world you inhabit, and the jokes had a specific quality of inside knowledge about how that world worked. All of these actors, these performers, these public faces, contributed to the specific vision of celebrity that Family Guy spent 25 years constructing and deconstructing. They were, collectively, the raw material of a culture's imagination, the names and faces that populated the shared dream that American entertainment constituted. Family Guy looked at that dream and asked questions about it. Funny questions, uncomfortable questions, questions that revealed the dream's machinery, the way the machinery was operated, and what it cost to keep it running. Section 17. The Season-by-Season Reference Guide. A decade-by-decade walk through the archive. Understanding Family Guy's real-person comedy in its full depth requires something more granular than the thematic sections we have been moving through. It requires a sense of when things happened, of how the catalog grew and changed across the show's extraordinary run. So let us spend some time walking through the decades that the show has occupied, noting the specific cultural moments that produced specific jokes, and feeling the texture of how the show's relationship with celebrity evolved not in theory but in the particular episodes, the particular years, the particular cultural moments that were happening when the writers sat down and asked themselves who was worth talking about. When the show began in 1990, but Dan, the cultural landscape was one that had been dominated for the previous decade by a very particular flavor of celebrity. The Clinton years had produced a specific kind of public figure, the politically savvy, personally charming, telegenic professional who understood the grammar of media appearances and deployed that understanding with obvious relish. Clinton himself was the supreme example, but the culture around him had its own celebrity structure that the show engaged with from the beginning. The technology boom of the late 1990s was producing its own celebrities, people who had become extraordinarily wealthy through the newly central internet economy and who were figuring out in real time what this new kind of wealth and influence meant. Family Guy was not deeply interested in Silicon Valley celebrity in these early years, though it would become more interested later. Its celebrity focus in the first 3 seasons was largely on the entertainment industry, on politicians, on the specific axis of fame that American television had been generating since the 1950s. The September 11th attacks of 2001 changed things in ways that are hard to fully articulate. The show was off the air when they happened, in the limbo of cancellation that preceded its revival. But when it came back in 2005, it came back into a country that had been fundamentally altered. The celebrities that matter change after a national trauma. The jokes that are possible change. The subjects that can be treated with full irreverence, and the subjects that require more care shift substantially. The show came back into a world where the Iraq War was the central political fact of American life, where the question of who had been right and who had been wrong about that war was the question around which political identities were being organized, where the specific figures who had made the arguments for invasion, including the president and his senior advisors, were now subject to the reassessment that follows the discovery that the stated reasons for a major decision were not accurate. Family Guy threw itself into this reassessment with enthusiasm. The years 2005 to 2010 were in many ways the show's golden age for political celebrity commentary. The political landscape was defined by Bush's second term and its growing controversies, then by the extraordinary Democratic primary of 2008 between Obama and Hillary Clinton, then by Obama's election and the specific cultural moment that election represented, then by the emergence of the Tea Party and the specific anger it mobilized. All of this was material, and the show used all of it. The entertainment celebrity landscape of this period was similarly rich. The mid-2000s were the years when Britney Spears' public struggles became daily entertainment news, when the early social media platforms were beginning to create new forms of celebrity and new ways for existing celebrities to destroy themselves publicly, when reality television had made celebrity accessible in a way that it had never been before. Family Guy moved through all of this, commenting on it, incorporating it, finding in it the material for jokes that ranged from gentle to savage. The 2010 to 2015 period was characterized by a different flavor of celebrity culture. The Obama years, past their initial euphoria, were settling into the complicated middle distance of actual governance, where the gap between aspiration and achievement was becoming more visible. The entertainment industry was being reshaped by streaming and by the new economics of content distribution. The specific celebrities who mattered were shifting as new platforms created new stars and old platforms lost ground. Family Guy in this period was also shifting. The departure of Seth MacFarlane from active creative oversight changed the show's relationship to its own comedy in ways that were reflected in how it engaged with real people. The show became in some ways more cautious and in other ways less so. The caution of a show without its original captain, and the carelessness of a show that was no longer being held to the standard of the person who had built it. The real person comedy of this period was more variable in quality than the earlier periods. There were episodes that showed the same precision and purpose that had characterized the best work of the earlier seasons, and there were episodes where the celebrity references felt like they were fulfilling a quota rather than serving any larger comic or critical purpose. The archive grew, but it grew unevenly. The post-2015 period, encompassing the Trump era and everything that followed, produced the most politically charged celebrity material the show had ever made. The specific intensity of the cultural and political moment meant that jokes about political figures had a weight they had not carried before, that the stakes felt genuinely high in a way that made comedy both more necessary and more difficult. The show navigated this with varying degrees of success, finding moments of genuine acuity alongside moments of exhaustion. The COVID pandemic of 2020 and the years that followed created another shift. The celebrities who mattered during those years were different ones. The scientists and public health officials who were suddenly on everyone's television screens, the politicians whose decisions affected daily life in ways that few government decisions had in living memory, the entertainers who found new ways to maintain connection with their audiences while the world was closed. Family Guy, which had always been made by a team of writers working in the same room, had to adapt to the conditions of distributed production, and the celebrity material of these episodes reflects the particular strangeness of that period. Looking across this whole arc, from 1999 to the present, what you see is not a steady line in any direction, but a series of peaks and valleys, moments of real inspiration and moments of genuine exhaustion, episodes that said something worth saying, and episodes that simply filled time. This is what any archive of 25 years of creative work looks like. It is a record of human effort, with all the inconsistency that implies. The specific value of the real person material, across all of those peaks and valleys, is that it anchored the show in something real. The fictional family in the fictional Rhode Island town might have become untethered from anything recognizable as human reality if not for the consistent presence of real people in the comedy, real people with real histories and real controversies, and real consequences in the actual world. The celebrity jokes were the tether. They kept the show in contact with the earth, with the specific historical moment it was living in, with the audience it was trying to reach. That tethering function was not always performed elegantly. It was not always performed responsibly. But it was performed, consistently, for 25 years, and the record it created is one of the most complete and most peculiar documents of celebrity culture that American television has produced. It is a document worth knowing, and on a slow, sleepy evening, worth exploring. Section 18. The finale. Thank you, good night, and one more thing worth saying. The fire is low now. Whatever light there is in the room where you are listening has gone warm and soft. The kind of light that does not demand anything of your eyes, that lets them do what they have been wanting to do for the past hour or two without making you feel like you are missing something. The voices have been keeping you company through all of this, through all the presidents and pop stars and athletes and actors and all the rest of them, and now the voices are going to say a few last things before they go quiet and let you sleep. There is one last thing worth exploring before we close, and it is something that all the preceding sections have been circling without quite landing on directly. It is the question of what we get from this. Not what Family Guy got from making these jokes, and not what the celebrities got from being in them, and not what the culture got from having them exist as part of the public record. What we, the audience, the people who watched and laughed and were occasionally uncomfortable, and occasionally moved and occasionally surprised by a joke that turned out to be more true than it looked, got from all of this. The answer, I think, is permission. Comedy about real people gives us permission to feel things about those people that polite culture does not always sanction. It gives us permission to feel the frustration and absurdity of watching someone powerful do something stupid, and to express that frustration in a form that is communal rather than solitary. It gives us permission to examine figures who carry enormous cultural weight with something other than pure reverence or pure contempt. It gives us permission to find the humanity in people who have been inflated by their fame into something more than human, and to find the strangeness in people who we have been asked to treat as normal when they are obviously not. This permission has value. It is not limitless value. and the comedy that claims it does not always use it responsibly. But it is real. There is something genuinely important about the cultural function of comedy that says, this famous person is also just a person, and we are allowed to notice that, and we are allowed to find it funny, and we are allowed to be angry about it, and we are allowed to be sad about it. And none of that requires us to abandon either our criticism or our affection. Family Guy has been doing this for 25 years. It has done it clumsily and brilliantly, and sometimes at the same time, in the same episode, in the same joke. It has made mistakes that it has occasionally tried to learn from. It has made discoveries that it has occasionally tried to build on. It has produced work that will age well and work that has already aged poorly, and work that is too strange and specific to have a relationship with aging at all, that simply exists in the particular moment that produced it as a record of what that moment felt like. The real people who passed through it did so with varying degrees of control over how they were depicted, varying degrees of awareness of what was being said, varying degrees of ability to push back or accept or engage with the version of themselves that the show had constructed. Some of them found it funny. Some of them found it offensive. Some of them probably never thought about it at all. Some of them became, through the alchemy of animation and writing and the specific genius of the voice cast, something more interesting in the show's version than they had managed to be in reality, which is either a tribute or an accusation depending on how you look at it. The show itself has become a real person in a certain sense, a figure with its own history and its own controversies and its own complicated legacy that people have strong feelings about. The jokes it told are part of the culture now, part of the archive, part of the record of how a specific group of people, in a specific time and place, tried to make sense of the world they were living in, through the medium of a cartoon family in a fictional Rhode Island town. That town, which we have been carefully not naming tonight, is a real place in the cultural imagination. The people who live there, fictional though they are, have been our companions through an enormous swath of American history. They were there for the Bush years and the Obama years and the Trump years and the pandemic and the recovery and the ongoing argument about who we are and who we want to be. They kept making jokes. Through all of it, they kept making jokes. There is something to be said for that. For the persistence of comedy in the face of everything that makes comedy seem insufficient, for the insistence on finding the funny even when nothing seems funny, for the specific courage, if we can call it that, of a show that has been on the air for 25 years, still trying, still reaching for something worth saying, still using the names of real people as a way of staying connected to the world that produced it. You may not always agree with what it said. Neither do I. The targets were not always fair. The methods were not always defensible. The history, when you look at it all together, is messier and more complicated than any single narrative of triumph or failure can capture. But it was real. It was a real attempt to do something with comedy that went beyond entertainment, to use the specific tools of animation and voice performance and cutaway gags and cultural references to say something about the world, to process the experience of living in a particular time and place, to find the comedy and the sadness and the absurdity and the occasional grace of being alive in a country that generates this much celebrity and this much confusion about what to do with it. And that is worth honoring, even at the end of a long night. So, if you have found your way to sleep by now, good, you deserved it. And if you are still with us, still listening, still half in the room and half in the comfortable fog of almost sleep, then know that the archive will be there tomorrow and the next day and the day after that. The presidents and the pop stars will wait. James Woods and his candy trail will wait. Tom Brady and his championships will wait. All of it will wait. For now, let the voices go quiet. Let the day fully go. Let whatever remains of your attention settle into the soft dark that is just sleep, just rest, just the simple, necessary repair that a long day earns. We will see you next time. And if you enjoyed this long exploration, if it accompanied you somewhere restful and interesting and worth the journey, please leave a like and a subscribe before you drift completely away. It tells us that this kind of company is worth keeping, that the long, slow stories about the strange and fascinating and occasionally infuriating world of celebrity are something you want more of. The channel lives on those signals, and making these takes time and care and a genuine love of the subjects we explore. Thank you for the company tonight. Good night and sweet dreams. Section 19. One final meditation on why we watch and why we remember. Before the last quiet settles in, there is one more current running beneath everything we have explored tonight, one more thread worth pulling on gently before we let the whole thing rest. It is the question of memory. We are, all of us, deeply social creatures. We did not evolve alone. We evolved in groups, in communities where the news of who did what and what it meant was the most vital information available, where knowing which members of the group were trustworthy and which were not was the difference between safety and danger. The gossip instinct, the deep appetite for stories about other people, especially prominent people whose decisions and behaviors have wide consequences, is not a frivolous thing. It is ancient. It is woven into the biology of how we process the world. Celebrity culture, at its root, is a modern expression of this ancient instinct. We track the famous the way our ancestors tracked the powerful. We want to know what they are doing, whether they are trustworthy, what their relationship with the rules is, whether they got away with something or were caught. Comedy about celebrities is a processing mechanism for all of this tracking, a way of metabolizing the enormous amount of information about famous people that the modern media environment produces, of finding a relationship with it that is manageable rather than overwhelming. Family Guy has been part of this processing mechanism for 25 years. It has helped its audience metabolize presidents and scandals and achievements and failures, has helped them find a relationship with the famous people who populate the shared cultural imagination that is neither pure worship nor pure contempt, but something more complicated and more honest than either. And the specific form it took, the animated comedy set in a fictional town with a fictional family who somehow always had access to the most famous people in the world, was in its own way a kind of miracle. It created a container large enough to hold 25 years of American celebrity culture and irreverent enough to handle what that culture actually contained, which was not always pleasant. The jokes live on. The references stay in the archive. The moments when the comedy pointed at something true and managed to make the truth funny without diminishing it, those moments are still there, still available, still capable of doing the thing they were designed to do. That is what good comedy does. It stays. The specific people who made these jokes, who sat in writing rooms and found the angles and argued over the lines and sent the scripts to the recording studio and watched the animation come back from wherever it was made and cut it together into episodes that went out to millions of people every Sunday night for over 2 decades, those people were doing something real, something that connected to the world in ways that are still visible if you look carefully at the archive. And the people in the jokes, the presidents and celebrities and athletes and all the rest, they were doing real things in the real world that the jokes were responding to. The jokes were not created in a vacuum. They were created in the specific friction between the show's sensibility and the ongoing messy reality of American public life, and that friction produced something worth preserving. You do not need to love Family Guy to appreciate what it documented. You do not need to find every joke funny or defensible or even particularly interesting. You just need to recognize that a show that spent 25 years making jokes about real people, in a culture as celebrity-saturated and media-dense and politically charged as late 20th and early 21st century America, was producing something that tells us about who we were and who we are. That is worth knowing, even at the very end of a long night. Even as sleep is already doing its slow, insistent work, you have been wonderful company. The archive will still be there in the morning. Appendix. The unsung references. A final tour through the overlooked corners of the archive. There are always the ones that almost get left out. The references that did not fit neatly into any of the preceding sections. The jokes that occupied corners of the archive rather than its center. The real people who appeared in Family Guy once or twice or a handful of times without ever becoming the focus of sustained analysis, but whose presence in the catalog is worth noting before we finally close. Martha Stewart appeared in material that engaged with her extraordinary brand of aspirational domesticity, the specific vision of elegant home life that she had built into a media empire, and the prison sentence she served in 2004 for crimes related to securities, fraud, and obstruction of justice. The Martha Stewart arc, from the queen of domestic perfectionism to convicted felon to recovered public figure, was the kind of story that Family Guy could not resist, because it contained within it such a complete portrait of American celebrity, the aspiration, the inevitable complication, the resilience that follows from having built something genuinely substantial underneath all the performance. Paris Hilton appeared in material from the mid-2000s that engaged with the specific phenomenon she represented. The celebrity who is famous primarily for being famous, the person whose public existence seems to be the entirety of the point, rather than a vehicle for any particular talent or achievement. This critique was common at the time and was directed at Paris Hilton with particular intensity, probably because she represented the phenomenon in its purest and most visible form. Family Guy participated in this critique while also occasionally acknowledging that the ability to turn celebrity into a commodity is itself a kind of skill that should not be entirely dismissed. Kim Kardashian appeared in later season material that was part of the broader engagement with the reality television celebrity world that Paris Hilton had pioneered, and that the Kardashian family had subsequently expanded into a genuinely remarkable business empire. The jokes about Kardashian engaged with the same questions about fame and talent and value that the Hilton material had raised, but in a context that had shifted enough that the questions had more complexity to them. Tiger Woods appeared in material from before and after the personal scandal that became public in 2009 and fundamentally changed how the public related to him. Pre-scandal Tiger was a figure of almost inhuman athletic excellence, someone whose dominance in his sport was so complete that it generated its own mythology. Post-scandal Tiger was a figure of public reckoning, of the same gap between image and reality story that the show had told about other figures in other sections. The show engaged with both versions, finding in the transition from one to the other material that was both comic and, if you were paying attention, genuinely melancholy. Lance Armstrong appeared in material that operated in the same vicinity as the Tiger material, the extraordinary athlete whose achievements turned out to be entangled with something that complicated them. The Armstrong story, with its extraordinary detail of organized deception, sustained over many years and then spectacularly unraveled, was one of the more complete examples of the kind of story that Family Guy had always been interested in. The story of the gap between the public achievement and what was actually required to produce it. Anna Nicole Smith appeared in jokes that engaged with the specific late career phase of her fame, which was characterized by the kind of tabloid attention that the show always found interesting as a subject. Her death in 2007, at 39, followed quickly by the death of her son, gave the material a darkness that retrospectively complicated whatever comedy had been in it. Lindsay Lohan appeared in material that was part of the same conversation as the Britney Spears material, engaging with the specific phenomenon of the young female celebrity, whose public struggles became a form of entertainment for a culture that was not always aware of what it was doing when it consumed that entertainment. The Lohan jokes, like the Spears jokes, are part of the cultural record of a moment that the culture has since reconsidered. These overlooked corners of the archive, these smaller threads and less prominent appearances, are part of the full picture. The headline-making moments, the James Woods mythology and the presidential portraits and the open secrets, those get the attention. But the full catalog is made up of hundreds of smaller references, momentary appearances, jokes that lasted 10 seconds, and then vanished back into the flow of the episode. All of those brief contacts with the real world accumulated, over 25 years, into something that is worth the name it claims. A record, an archive, a very long and very strange document of a culture's relationship with the people it makes famous. The last candle is going out now. The voices have said nearly everything they came to say. The archive will keep, the jokes will keep. The real people they were about, the living ones and the ones who have since left, will keep their place in the cultural memory that comedy helps maintain. Sleep well. The world will still be there in the morning, with all its famous people and all its reasons for jokes, and it will make sense in the daylight the way it always does, which is to say imperfectly and with great affection.